Welcome to another soothing episode of Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we'll be exploring the less than glamorous realities of pirate life on the high seas, along with other mundane historical facts designed to lull you into a peaceful slumber. As we set sail on this tranquil journey through time, prepare to discover why being a pirate wasn't all treasure and adventure. In the coming hour, we'll delve into the cramped living quarters, rampant diseases, and constant threat of capture that plagued these seafaring rogues. But that's not all. We'll also meander through other soporific historical topics, from the tedious process of medieval bookbinding to the mind-numbing intricacies of ancient Roman plumbing systems. So settle in, close your eyes, and let the gentle waves of monotonous historical facts carry you off to dreamland. Remember, the more bored you feel, the better you'll sleep. Now, let's hoist the anchor and drift into our first topic. Before we dive deeper into the treacherous waters of pirate life, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It helps us bring more soothing historical content to lull you into a peaceful slumber. Now, let's continue our journey. As we sail deeper into the world of piracy, let's explore the daily routine of these seafaring rogues. Contrary to popular belief, the life of a pirate was far from glamorous. In fact, it was often monotonous, grueling, and fraught with danger. A typical day for a pirate began at dawn. The night watch would rouse the crew with shouts and the ringing of a bell. As the sun peeked over the horizon, pirates would crawl out of their cramped sleeping quarters, often little more than hammocks strung up in the dank, dark lower decks. Breakfast, if you could call it that, was a meager affair. Pirates typically subsisted on hardtack, a type of biscuit so tough it could break teeth if not soaked in water or rum first. Occasionally, they might have salted pork or beef, but these were often rancid and crawling with maggots. After this less than appetizing meal, the crew would begin their daily chores. Contrary to the swashbuckling image we often associate with pirates, much of their time was spent on mundane tasks essential for keeping the ship afloat and functional. One of the most crucial jobs was swabbing the deck. This wasn't just about cleanliness, it was a matter of survival. Wet wooden decks would swell, closing up any small leaks and preventing water from seeping into the lower decks. The constant scrubbing also helped prevent the wood from rotting in the salty sea air. Another vital task was checking and maintaining the rigging. Pirates would climb the masts, inspecting ropes and sails for any signs of wear or damage. A torn sail or frayed rope could spell disaster in rough seas or during a chase. Speaking of chases, pirates spent a significant amount of time on lookout duty. Crews would take turns manning the crow's nest, scanning the horizon for potential prey or threats. This task was particularly monotonous, requiring hours of concentration while perched high above the deck, swaying with the ship's motion. When not engaged in these essential tasks, pirates might occupy themselves with various activities to stave off boredom. Some would mend clothes or repair equipment, while others might engage in games of chance using crude dice or cards. However, these moments of relative leisure were few and far between. The constant threat of scurvy loomed over every pirate crew. This debilitating disease, caused by vitamin C deficiency, could decimate a ship's complement in a matter of weeks. To combat this, pirates would often supplement their diet with lime juice when available, earning British sailors the nickname limeys. As the day wore on, the heat became oppressive, especially in tropical waters. Pirates working on deck would suffer from sunburn and heatstroke, while those below decks endured stifling, airless conditions. The stench of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and human waste permeated every corner of the ship. Hydration was a constant concern. Fresh water was a precious commodity on long voyages, and it often became stagnant and fouled with algae. To make it more palatable, pirates would often mix it with rum or beer, which, while momentarily refreshing, only exacerbated dehydration in the long run. As evening approached, the crew would gather for the main meal of the day. This was usually a stew or soup made from whatever ingredients were available, often featuring weevil-infested flour, dried peas, and salted meat. On rare occasions, when a ship had recently raided a merchant vessel or made port, the pirates might enjoy fresher fare like fruits or vegetables. After dinner, those not on night watch might engage in storytelling or singing sea shanties. These moments of camaraderie were essential for maintaining morale on long voyages. However, they were often cut short by the need for sleep, as the grueling daily routine left most pirates exhausted. As night fell, a skeleton crew would remain on deck to man the helm and keep watch. The rest of the pirates would retire to their hammocks, crammed together in the stuffy lower decks. Sleep was often fitful, disturbed by the constant creaking of the ship, the snoring of fellow crew members, and the ever-present risk of attack by rival pirates or naval vessels. This cycle would repeat day after day, week after week, with little variation. The monotony was occasionally broken by storms, which brought their own set of dangers. During these times, all hands would be called on deck to secure rigging, pump out water, and struggle to keep the ship afloat amidst towering waves and howling winds. Perhaps the most dreaded aspect of pirate life was the constant threat of injury or illness. Medical care on pirate ships was primitive at best. The ship's surgeon, often little more than a butcher with a saw, would attempt to treat wounds and ailments with crude tools and limited knowledge. Amputations were common, performed without anesthesia, and frequently resulting in deadly infections. Despite the hardships, many men chose the life of a pirate over the alternatives available to them. For some, it was an escape from the even harsher conditions of merchant or naval vessels. For others, it represented a chance at wealth and freedom in a world that offered few opportunities for social mobility. However, the reality of pirate life rarely lived up to the romanticized tales that have captivated our imaginations for centuries. It was a life of hardship, danger, and often disappointment. The vast majority of pirates never achieved the fabulous wealth they sought, instead eking out a meager existence on the fringes of society, always one step ahead of the law. As we conclude this look into the daily routine of pirate life, we can see that it was far from the adventurous, swashbuckling existence often portrayed in popular culture. It was, in fact, a grueling, monotonous, and perilous way of life that few would truly envy if they knew the harsh realities. As we sail deeper into the treacherous waters of pirate life, let's turn our attention to the floating fortresses these seafaring rogues called home. The pirate ships of the golden age of piracy were far from the glamorous vessels often portrayed in Hollywood blockbusters. In reality, life aboard these vessels was a constant struggle against discomfort, disease, and danger. Picture yourself aboard a typical pirate ship of the early 18th century. The first thing that would assault your senses is the overwhelming stench. The combination of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and the ever-present reek of tar used to waterproof the ship created an odor so potent it could make even the hardiest sailor gag. The living quarters, if you could call them that, were cramped and squalid. Most of the crew slept on the gun deck, wedged between the cannons and hammocks strung so close together you could barely turn without bumping into your neighbor. Privacy was non-existent, and personal space was a luxury few could afford. The constant dampness below decks led to the growth of mold and mildew, which not only added to the nauseating smell, but also contributed to respiratory problems among the crew. The damp conditions also meant that clothes rarely dried completely, leading to skin infections and fungal growths that could plague a sailor for months. Rats and other vermin were constant companions on these floating cities. These unwelcome guests not only ate into the already limited food supplies, but also spread disease. Lice and fleas were so common that they were considered an unavoidable part of shipboard life. Speaking of food, the diet aboard a pirate ship was far from appetizing. The staple was hardtack, a type of biscuit so tough it often had to be soaked in water or beer to be edible. This rock-hard bread was often infested with weevils, adding an unwanted protein boost to each bite. Salted meat was another dietary mainstay, but it was often so heavily preserved that it bore little resemblance to fresh meat. The salt used in preservation could lead to dehydration, a constant concern on long voyages where fresh water was a precious commodity. Fresh fruits and vegetables were rare luxuries, usually only available immediately after leaving port or raiding another ship. This lack of vitamin C in the diet led to scurvy, a disease that caused gums to bleed, teeth to fall out, and old wounds to reopen. The ship's cook, often a crew member who had lost a limb and could no longer perform other duties, prepared meals in the galley. This small, cramped space was one of the most dangerous areas on the ship. Open flames used for cooking could easily spread, potentially engulfing the entire wooden vessel in minutes. Water storage was another critical issue. Fresh water was stored in wooden casks, which could become breeding grounds for algae and bacteria. As voyages progressed, the water would turn increasingly foul, often developing a thick green scum on top. Many sailors preferred to drink alcohol, which was safer but led to its own set of problems, including dehydration and drunken accidents. The constant motion of the ship posed its own challenges. Seasickness was common, especially among new crew members. Even experienced sailors could find themselves battling nausea during particularly rough weather. The rolling and pitching of the ship made even simple tasks like walking or eating a challenge. Injuries were an ever-present danger. The complex rigging of a sailing ship was a maze of ropes and wooden spars that could easily crush or entangle an unwary sailor. Falls from the rigging were common and often fatal. Even on calm days, the pitch and roll of the ship could send a man tumbling across the deck or into the unforgiving sea. The constant exposure to the elements took its toll on the crew. Sun, wind, and salt spray weathered skin and caused painful cracking and blistering. Eyes suffered from the constant glare off the water, leading to early blindness for many career sailors. Maintaining personal hygiene was a near impossible task. Fresh water was too precious to waste on bathing, and soap was a rare luxury. Most pirates went weeks or even months without a proper wash, leading to skin conditions and contributing to the overall stench of the ship. The lack of proper sanitation facilities was another major issue. The heads, or toilets, were usually just holes in the beakhead at the front of the ship. Using these facilities was a precarious business, especially in rough seas, and falling overboard was a real risk. Despite these harsh conditions, the ship was more than just a vessel for pirates. It was a floating community. The close quarters and shared hardships often forged strong bonds among the crew. This camaraderie was essential for survival in the face of the numerous challenges they faced daily. The ship's structure itself was a constant source of concern. Wooden ships required continuous maintenance to remain seaworthy. Leaks were common, and crews often had to pump water out of the hold around the clock to keep the ship afloat. The constant presence of water also led to wood rot, weakening the ship's structure over time. In tropical waters, shipworms posed an additional threat. These marine mollusks bored into the wooden hull, potentially compromising the ship's integrity. Regular careening, beaching the ship to scrape and repair the hull, was necessary but left the crew vulnerable to attack. The ever-present danger of fire was another major concern. With wooden construction, tar-coated ropes, and canvas sails, pirate ships were highly flammable. A stray spark from a cannon, a misplaced lantern, or even a lightning strike could spell disaster. Firefighting equipment was primitive at best, often consisting of little more than buckets passed hand to hand. Despite these myriad challenges, pirates continued to ply their trade on the high seas. The promise of riches, freedom from societal constraints, and the allure of adventure were powerful motivators that helped many endure these harsh conditions. However, the reality of life aboard a pirate ship was far from the romantic ideal often portrayed in popular culture. As we conclude this segment on ship conditions, remember that these floating fortresses of filth and discomfort were home to some of history's most notorious characters. In our next segment, we'll delve into the daily routines and duties that kept these seafaring rogues occupied during their long voyages across the treacherous seas. As we continue our journey through the less glamorous aspects of pirate life, let's turn our attention to the daily struggles pirates faced with nutrition and health. Far from the romanticized tales of buried treasure and swashbuckling adventures, the reality of pirate life was often marked by malnutrition, disease, and a constant battle against the harsh elements of the sea. First, let's consider the typical pirate diet. Contrary to popular belief, there were no lavish feasts or endless supplies of rum. Instead, pirates had to make do with whatever provisions they could obtain, often leading to a monotonous and nutritionally poor diet. The staple food for pirates was known as hardtack or ship's biscuit. These were dense, dry crackers made from flour, water, and sometimes salt. They were designed to last for months without spoiling, but this came at a cost. Hardtack was notoriously difficult to eat, often requiring soaking in water or other liquids to make it palatable. Imagine biting into what essentially amounts to a rock-hard cracker day after day. It's no wonder that many pirates suffered from dental problems. The constant gnawing on these tough biscuits would wear down their teeth, leading to painful infections and tooth loss. To supplement their diet of hardtack, pirates would also consume salted meat, typically beef or pork. This meat was heavily salted to prevent spoilage during long voyages. While it provided some protein, the high salt content came with its own set of health issues, including dehydration and increased blood pressure. Fresh fruits and vegetables were a rare luxury on pirate ships. Without proper refrigeration or preservation methods, these items would quickly spoil at sea. As a result, many pirates suffered from scurvy, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency. Scurvy was a dreaded condition among sailors and pirates alike. Its symptoms included swollen, bleeding gums, loosening of teeth, and reopening of old wounds. In severe cases, it could lead to death. The irony is that citrus fruits, which could easily prevent scurvy, were often considered a valuable prize when raiding other ships. Water was another precious commodity on pirate ships. Fresh water would quickly become stagnant and contaminated during long voyages. To combat this, pirates often mixed their water with alcohol, typically rum or beer. While this helped kill some bacteria, it also led to chronic dehydration and alcohol dependency among crew members. The cramped and unsanitary conditions on pirate ships were a breeding ground for various diseases. Dysentery, typhoid fever, and cholera were common afflictions. The lack of proper medical knowledge and treatment options meant that even minor illnesses could quickly become life-threatening. Parasites were another constant concern. Lice, fleas, and rats infested many pirate ships, spreading disease and making life miserable for the crew. The damp, dark conditions below deck were perfect for these pests to thrive, and controlling infestations was an ongoing battle. Injuries were also a significant health concern for pirates. Whether from battles, accidents on the ship, or the harsh weather conditions, wounds were common. Without proper medical care, even minor cuts could become infected, leading to gangrene or blood poisoning. The role of the ship's surgeon when present was often more gruesome than helpful. Medical knowledge was limited, and treatments were often based on superstition rather than science. Amputations were common, performed without anesthesia and with rudimentary tools. Many pirates died from the shock and blood loss associated with these crude surgeries. Mental health was another overlooked aspect of pirate life. The constant stress of living under the threat of capture or death, combined with long periods of isolation at sea, took a toll on the psychological well-being of many pirates. Depression, anxiety, and what we might now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder were likely common, though undiagnosed and untreated. The myth of pirates always having access to abundant rum is just that, a myth. While alcohol was indeed present on pirate ships, it was often rationed carefully. Drunk pirates were a liability in battle and could endanger the entire crew during naval maneuvers. However, the harsh realities of pirate life did drive many to seek solace in alcohol when available, leading to addiction and its associated health problems. Let's not forget the impact of constant exposure to the elements. Pirates spent most of their time outdoors, subjected to intense sun, wind, and salt spray. This led to premature aging of the skin, eye problems, and various other health issues. The lack of proper sun protection meant that skin cancer was likely common, though it would have gone undiagnosed in those times. The physical demands of life at sea also took their toll. Constant manual labor, from hoisting sails to scrubbing decks, led to chronic joint pain, muscle injuries, and back problems. The uneven, constantly moving surface of a ship at sea meant that even simple tasks required extra effort and balance, leading to fatigue and increased risk of accidents. In conclusion, the reality of pirate health and nutrition was far from the romanticized version often portrayed in popular culture. It was a constant struggle against malnutrition, disease, injury, and the harsh elements of the sea. The next time you imagine the life of a pirate, remember that behind the adventure and excitement lay a grim reality of poor health, constant discomfort, and the ever-present specter of an early death. As we move on to our next topic, consider how these health challenges would have impacted the daily lives and decisions of pirates. Their constant battle against illness and injury surely influenced their choices, their loyalties, and their willingness to risk their lives in pursuit of treasure and freedom on the high seas. As we sail deeper into the treacherous waters of pirate life, we encounter one of the most brutal aspects of their existence: discipline and punishment. The romanticized image of pirates as free-spirited rebels quickly dissipates when we examine the harsh realities they faced aboard their ships. Pirate ships, contrary to popular belief, were not lawless zones of chaos. They operated under strict codes of conduct, often more severe than those found in legitimate naval vessels. These codes were necessary to maintain order and ensure the survival of the crew in the unforgiving environment of the high seas. One of the most common forms of discipline aboard pirate ships was flogging. This brutal punishment involved tying the offender to the mast and whipping them with a cat o' nine tails, a multi-tailed whip that could tear flesh from bone with each lash. Sound effect: whip cracking. Imagine the searing pain as the whip's knotted cords bit into your back, leaving deep, bloody furrows. The number of lashes varied depending on the severity of the offense, but it wasn't uncommon for a pirate to receive dozens of lashes for relatively minor infractions. Another dreaded punishment was keel hauling, a practice so severe it was often tantamount to a death sentence. The unfortunate victim would be tied to a rope and dragged underneath the ship from one side to the other. Sound effect: splashing water and creaking ship. Picture yourself being plunged into the icy depths, your lungs burning for air as you're dragged along the barnacle-encrusted hull. The sharp shells would slice your skin to ribbons, and if you survived the ordeal, infection from your wounds would likely claim your life in the days that followed. For more serious offenses, pirates might face marooning. This involved being abandoned on a deserted island or remote stretch of coastline with limited supplies. The unlucky soul would be given a pistol with a single shot, a bottle of water, and perhaps a small amount of food. Sound effect: waves lapping on a shore. Imagine the crushing despair as you watch your ship disappear over the horizon, leaving you alone to face an almost certain death from exposure, starvation, or dehydration. The single bullet in your pistol offered a grim choice: a quick death by your own hand or a slow, agonizing demise at the mercy of the elements. Even more chilling was the practice of being put to the mast. This involved tying the offender to the mast during a battle, leaving them exposed to enemy fire with no means of defense. It was a cruel way to dispose of troublemakers while simultaneously using them as human shields. Sound effect: cannon fire and splintering wood. Can you fathom the terror of being bound and helpless as cannonballs whiz past your head, knowing that at any moment a shot could tear you apart? The psychological torture of this punishment was often as devastating as its physical consequences. It's important to note that these punishments weren't just meted out for major crimes like mutiny or theft. Even minor infractions could result in severe consequences. Sleeping on watch, quarreling with crewmates, or failing to keep your weapons in good condition could all lead to brutal reprimands. The harshness of these punishments served a dual purpose. First, they acted as a deterrent, discouraging pirates from breaking the ship's code of conduct. Second, they reinforced the captain's authority, which was crucial for maintaining order in the confined and often volatile environment of a pirate ship. However, it's worth noting that not all pirate captains ruled through fear alone. Many recognized the importance of crew morale and tried to balance discipline with fairness. Some pirate codes, like that of Bartholomew Roberts, included provisions for compensating injured crew members and sharing plunder equitably. Sound effect: coins clinking. Despite these occasional nods to fairness, life aboard a pirate ship remained brutally hard. The constant threat of severe punishment hung over every crew member like the sword of Damocles, ready to fall at the slightest provocation. This culture of harsh discipline extended beyond individual ships to the broader pirate community. Pirate havens like Port Royal in Jamaica and Tortuga in the Caribbean had their own brutal methods of maintaining order among the rowdy buccaneers who frequented their shores. Sound effect: tavern ambience with rowdy voices. In these lawless ports, disputes were often settled with violence, and those who crossed the wrong people might find themselves on the receiving end of unofficial punishments that rivaled the brutality of those aboard ship. The fear of capture by naval forces or bounty hunters added another layer of potential punishment to a pirate's life. If caught, pirates faced swift and merciless justice. Public executions were common, with pirates often hanged at the entrance to harbors as a warning to others. Sound effect: creaking rope and crowd murmurs. The bodies of executed pirates would be left to rot in gibbets, iron cages suspended from gallows, serving as a grim reminder of the fate that awaited those who chose the pirate's life. In conclusion, while the life of a pirate may have offered a chance at riches and adventure, it came at a terrible cost. The constant threat of brutal punishment, both from within their own ranks and from the authorities they defied, made the pirates' existence a precarious balancing act between freedom and fear. As we drift off to sleep, let's be grateful that we don't have to worry about keel-hauling or flogging as consequences for our daily mistakes. The harsh realities of pirate discipline serve as a stark reminder of how far we've come in our concepts of justice and human rights. In our next segment, we'll explore another aspect of pirate life that was far from glamorous: the constant battle against disease and malnutrition at sea. But for now, let the gentle rocking of imaginary waves lull you into a peaceful slumber, free from the worries of a pirate's harsh existence. As we sail deeper into the treacherous waters of pirate life, let's confront the grim reality of combat at sea. The romanticized notion of swashbuckling adventures often glosses over the brutal and terrifying nature of maritime warfare during the golden age of piracy. First and foremost, let's dispel the myth of constant battles. Contrary to popular belief, pirates didn't engage in combat as frequently as you might think. Their primary goal was to intimidate merchant ships into surrendering without a fight. This strategy was not born out of mercy, but rather practicality. Every battle risked damage to their own ship, injury to crew members, and potential loss of valuable loot. When combat did occur, it was far from the choreographed sword fights we see in movies. The reality was much more chaotic and terrifying. Picture this: you're standing on a rolling deck, surrounded by deafening cannon fire and thick, choking smoke. The acrid smell of gunpowder fills your nostrils as splinters of wood fly through the air like deadly projectiles. Speaking of projectiles, let's talk about the weapons of choice. While cutlasses and pistols were indeed used, they weren't the primary tools of destruction. Cannons were the true kings of naval warfare. These massive iron beasts could unleash devastating broadsides, tearing through wood, flesh, and bone with equal ferocity. But aiming these cannons was no easy feat. The constant motion of the ship, combined with the smoke and chaos of battle, made accuracy a significant challenge. Many shots missed their mark entirely, prolonging battles and increasing the risk for both sides. When ships did manage to get close enough for boarding actions, the real horror began. Pirates would throw grappling hooks to pull the ships together, then swarm across using planks or by swinging on ropes. This moment was perhaps the most terrifying for both attackers and defenders. Imagine the fear coursing through your veins as you see a horde of battle-hardened pirates, their faces contorted with rage and bloodlust, charging towards you. The deck becomes a frenzied melee of slashing blades, pistol shots, and desperate hand-to-hand combat. But it wasn't just the enemy you had to worry about. Friendly fire was a constant danger in the confusion of battle. In the heat of the moment, it was all too easy to mistake friend for foe, leading to tragic accidents that could decimate a crew's morale. Let's not forget the gruesome injuries sustained in these battles. Medical care at sea was primitive at best. A cut from a rusty blade could lead to fatal infections. Cannonball wounds often resulted in amputations performed with rudimentary tools and no anesthesia. Many injured pirates were simply tossed overboard, their screams drowned out by the roar of the waves. Even if you survived the initial combat, the aftermath could be just as deadly. Damaged ships often sank slowly, leaving survivors to face the merciless sea. Those who managed to cling to floating debris might face days of exposure, dehydration, and shark-infested waters before rescue, if it ever came. For those captured alive, the future was equally grim. Piracy was considered a heinous crime, and most nations showed no mercy to captured buccaneers. The lucky ones might face a quick execution by hanging. The less fortunate could look forward to prolonged torture, public humiliation, and ultimately a slow, agonizing death. One particularly gruesome fate awaited some captured pirates, gibbeting. This involved hanging the pirate's body in an iron cage in a public place, often near the coast. The corpse would be left to rot as a warning to other would-be pirates, sometimes for years. Imagine the psychological impact of seeing your former comrades remain swinging in the breeze as you sailed past. It's also worth noting that not all pirates were willing participants. Many were forced into service through impressment or had turned to piracy out of desperation. For these reluctant buccaneers, combat was an even more terrifying prospect, as they lacked the hardened resolve of career criminals. The psychological toll of this constant threat of violence cannot be overstated. Many pirates turned to alcohol to numb their fears, leading to further problems with discipline and combat readiness. The combination of drunkenness and high-stakes warfare was a recipe for disaster. Let's also consider the long-term effects on those who survived multiple engagements. Post-traumatic stress disorder, though not recognized at the time, was undoubtedly common among pirates. Nightmares, flashbacks, and crippling anxiety would have plagued many long after they left the sea behind. It's important to remember that pirate ships were not homogeneous crews. They often consisted of men from various nationalities, backgrounds, and even former enemies forced to work together. This diversity could lead to internal conflicts and divided loyalties during battle, further complicating an already chaotic situation. The harsh reality of combat at sea extended beyond just the immediate dangers. The constant stress and vigilance required to survive in such a hostile environment took a severe toll on the pirates' mental and physical health. Malnutrition, lack of sleep, and the ever-present threat of violence created a perfect storm of misery. In conclusion, the reality of combat for pirates was far removed from the romanticized version we often see in popular culture. It was a brutal, terrifying, and often short-lived experience that left deep scars on those who survived. The next time you think about the exciting life of a pirate, remember the grim reality that lurked behind the Jolly Roger. As we conclude our exploration of the harsh realities of pirate life, it's clear that the romanticized image of swashbuckling adventurers falls far short of the grim truth. Let's recap the key reasons why being a pirate on the high seas was far from glamorous. First and foremost, the constant threat of violence and death loomed over every pirate. Whether facing rival pirates, naval forces, or even their own crewmates, pirates lived with the knowledge that each day could be their last. The romantic notion of duels and honorable combat was overshadowed by the brutal reality of close-quarters fighting, where survival often depended on ruthlessness rather than skill. The physical toll of pirate life was equally devastating. Injuries were common and medical care was primitive at best. A simple cut could lead to a deadly infection, while more severe wounds often resulted in crude amputations. The lack of proper nutrition and constant exposure to the elements further weakened pirates' health, making them susceptible to a host of diseases. Life aboard a pirate ship was far from comfortable. Cramped, unsanitary conditions were the norm, with pirates often sleeping in shifts due to limited space. The constant dampness and poor ventilation below decks created an ideal breeding ground for vermin and disease. Add to this the monotony of long voyages with little to do between raids, and the psychological strain becomes apparent. The hierarchical structure of pirate crews, while more democratic than naval vessels of the time, still led to frequent conflicts and power struggles. The constant need to maintain order through intimidation and violence created a tense atmosphere where trust was scarce and alliances were fragile. Even successful pirates faced significant challenges. The difficulty in spending or saving their ill-gotten gains meant that many lived hand-to-mouth despite their lucrative raids. The constant need to resupply and repair their ships ate into profits, while the risk of capture or betrayal made long-term financial stability nearly impossible. Speaking of capture, the fate awaiting pirates who fell into the hands of authorities was grim indeed. Torture, public execution, and the display of bodies as a warning to others were common practices. The knowledge that such a fate could await them at any port must have weighed heavily on the minds of even the most hardened pirates. The environmental challenges of life at sea were relentless. Storms could sink ships or leave crews stranded, while calm winds could trap vessels for days or weeks, leading to dwindling supplies and rising tensions. The constant exposure to sun, salt, and wind took a toll on both ships and sailors, accelerating wear and tear on both. Pirate crews were often a volatile mix of different nationalities, cultures, and backgrounds, united only by their outlaw status. This diversity, while potentially advantageous in some ways, also led to frequent misunderstandings, conflicts, and power struggles that could tear a crew apart from within. Finally, the psychological impact of choosing a life of piracy cannot be understated. Cut off from society, family, and any hope of a normal life, pirates were essentially committing to a path of no return. The weight of their actions, the constant danger, and the knowledge that they could never truly rejoin civilized society must have been a heavy burden to bear. In conclusion, while tales of pirate adventure may capture our imagination, the reality of pirate life was far from enviable. It was an existence marked by hardship, violence, and uncertainty, where the promise of freedom and riches was often overshadowed by the harsh realities of life as an outlaw on the high seas. The next time you encounter a romanticized portrayal of pirate life, remember the grim truth behind the myth. It truly did suck to be a pirate on the high seas. As we sail away from the treacherous waters of pirate life, let's dock our ship of knowledge at a new port of historical intrigue. Our next destination takes us from the rolling seas to the bustling streets of ancient civilization. Prepare to journey through time as we explore why it wasn't always glamorous to be a citizen in some of history's most famous empires. Brace yourself for tales of everyday struggles in the shadows of grand monuments. As we sail away from the treacherous waters of piracy, let's journey back in time to ancient Rome, where another group of individuals faced their own perilous existence. Welcome to our secondary topic, ancient Roman gladiators. These warriors of the arena have captivated our imaginations for centuries, but the reality of their lives was far from glamorous. Imagine yourself transported to the bustling streets of Rome in the 1st century AD. The air is thick with the scent of spices, sweat, and anticipation. In the distance, you hear the roar of the crowd emanating from the Colosseum. It's a gladiatorial event day, and the city is alive with excitement. But behind the scenes, a different story unfolds. Gladiators were often slaves, prisoners of war, or criminals condemned to fight for their lives in the arena. Some were volunteers seeking fame and fortune, but they were the minority. The life of a gladiator was one of intense training, strict discipline, and constant danger. Let's delve into the harsh realities these ancient warriors faced. First, let's consider their living conditions. Gladiators were typically housed in ludus or gladiatorial schools. These were more like prisons than educational institutions. The ludus was a place of confinement where gladiators lived in small, cramped cells. They were constantly under guard, their movements restricted, and their personal freedoms severely limited. The daily routine of a gladiator was grueling. They would wake at dawn to begin their training, which lasted for hours under the scorching Roman sun. Their diet, while protein-rich, was far from luxurious. They were often referred to as barley men due to the large quantities of barley they consumed. This diet was designed to build a layer of fat to protect vital organs during combat, not for their enjoyment or health. Training was brutal and unforgiving. Gladiators were pushed to their physical limits every day. They practiced with wooden weapons that were heavier than their metal counterparts used in actual combat. This was to build strength and endurance. Injuries during training were common, and medical care was basic at best. A gladiator with a serious injury might find himself discarded or worse, forced to fight in a weakened state. The psychological toll on gladiators was immense. They lived with the constant knowledge that any day could be their last. The bonds they formed with fellow gladiators were bittersweet, as they might be forced to fight and kill each other in the arena. Imagine the mental anguish of potentially having to take the life of someone you've trained alongside, eaten with, and come to know as a friend. Now let's talk about the fights themselves. Contrary to popular belief, not all gladiatorial combats were to the death. In fact, skilled gladiators were valuable assets, and their owners often tried to keep them alive. However, this didn't make the fights any less dangerous. Even if death wasn't the intended outcome, severe injuries were common. A gladiator might survive the arena only to succumb to infections or complications from their wounds later. The types of gladiators varied, each with their own specialized weapons and armor. There were the heavily armored secutors, the trident-wielding retiarii, and the exotic essidarii who fought from chariots, among others. Each type had its own advantages and disadvantages, but all faced the same brutal reality in the arena. One of the most psychologically taxing aspects of a gladiator's life was the lack of control over their fate. Even if they won their bout, their life could still be forfeit if the crowd or the emperor decided against them. The famous thumbs up or thumbs down gesture, which, interestingly, may have been the reverse of what we think today, could mean the difference between life and death. For those gladiators who did survive and gain fame, life could improve somewhat. Successful gladiators could earn prize money, gain a following among the Roman populace, and even win their freedom. However, the path to this success was paved with the broken bodies and crushed spirits of countless others who weren't so fortunate. It's important to note that while gladiatorial combat was a central part of Roman entertainment for centuries, attitudes towards it did change over time. Some Roman philosophers and leaders criticized the practice as cruel and detrimental to society. Emperor Marcus Aurelius, for instance, tried to make the games less lethal by having the gladiators fight with blunted weapons. Despite these attempts at reform, the gladiatorial games remained a brutal spectacle until they were finally abolished in the 5th century AD. The last known gladiatorial fight in Rome took place on January 1, 404 AD, marking the end of this bloody chapter in Roman history. As we reflect on the lives of these ancient warriors, it's clear that the glamorized version of gladiators we often see in movies and TV shows is far from the truth. Their existence was one of hardship, violence, and uncertainty. While some may have found glory, for most, being a gladiator was a grim sentence rather than a choice. In our next segment, we'll delve deeper into the specific types of gladiators and the intricacies of their combat. But for now, let this introduction serve as a reminder of the harsh realities faced by these iconic figures of ancient Rome. Their story is a testament to the human capacity for endurance in the face of extreme adversity, and a stark reminder of how far we've come in our treatment of fellow human beings. As we sail away from the treacherous waters of piracy, let's journey back in time to ancient Rome, where another group of individuals faced their own unique set of challenges. We're talking about the gladiators, those iconic warriors of the arena who captured the imagination of Romans and continue to fascinate us to this day. But what was life really like for these combatants? Let's delve into the rigorous training regimen of a Roman gladiator. Contrary to popular belief, most gladiators weren't slaves captured in battle and forced to fight. Many were volunteers who signed contracts, willingly embracing the gladiatorial life. These individuals, known as auctorati, saw gladiatorial combat as a path to fame, glory, and potentially freedom. However, the road to becoming a celebrated arena warrior was far from easy. The journey began at a ludus, a specialized gladiatorial school. These institutions were often owned by wealthy Romans called lanisti, who invested in training gladiators as a business venture. The moment an aspiring gladiator stepped into a ludus, they entered a world of strict discipline, intense physical conditioning, and specialized combat training. Daily life in a ludus was regimented and grueling. Gladiators in training would rise at dawn, their day beginning with a hearty breakfast. This meal was crucial, as their training regimen demanded immense energy and stamina. The diet of a gladiator might surprise you. They were often referred to as barley men due to the high amount of grains in their diet, supplemented with beans and dried fruit. This carb-heavy diet was designed to build a layer of protective fat over their muscles, which would make cuts and slashes in the arena less severe and more visually appealing to the audience. After breakfast, the real work began. The morning was typically devoted to intense physical conditioning. Gladiators would engage in long-distance running to build endurance, weightlifting with heavy stones or lead weights to increase strength, and various calisthenics to improve overall fitness and agility. This grueling routine would last for several hours, pushing the trainees to their physical limits. But physical fitness was only part of the equation. Gladiators also needed to master a wide array of weapons and fighting styles. The afternoon sessions were dedicated to weapons training and combat techniques. Under the watchful eye of a doctor, an experienced gladiator who served as an instructor, trainees would practice with wooden weapons, perfecting their form and technique before graduating to real steel. Each gladiator typically specialized in a particular fighting style, each with its own unique set of weapons and armor. For instance, the Murmillo fought with a gladius short sword and carried a large, oblong shield. They wore a helmet with a fish-shaped crest, giving them their nickname of fishmen. In contrast, the Retiarius fought with a net, trident, and dagger, wearing minimal armor to maximize mobility. Regardless of their specialization, all gladiators had to become proficient in multiple styles. This versatility was crucial, as they never knew what type of opponent they might face in the arena. Hours were spent practicing offensive and defensive maneuvers, footwork, and tactics specific to each style of combat. But it wasn't all about individual skill. Gladiators also trained in pairs and small groups, learning to work together and anticipate their opponent's moves. These mock battles, fought with wooden weapons, could be almost as dangerous as real combat. Injuries were common, and the training was designed to be as realistic as possible to prepare the gladiators for the real thing. As the sun began to set, the physical training would come to an end, but the day wasn't over yet. Evenings in the ludus were often devoted to mental preparation. Gladiators would study the history of famous battles, analyze the techniques of legendary fighters, and even receive some basic medical training to help them treat wounds and recover from injuries. Discipline was paramount in a gladiator's life. Breaking rules or showing disrespect could result in severe punishments, including beatings or being placed in chains. However, good behavior and exceptional skill were rewarded with better food, living conditions, and even the possibility of eventual freedom. Despite the harsh conditions and constant danger, many gladiators took pride in their profession. They developed a strong sense of camaraderie with their fellow fighters, and the most skilled among them became celebrities in Roman society. The famous oath taken by gladiators, narrator. It's important to note that not all gladiatorial combat ended in death. While fatalities certainly occurred, many fights were more about skill and showmanship than a fight to the death. A gladiator who fought well but was defeated could be spared by the editor, the official overseeing the games, often at the behest of the crowd. The rigorous training of gladiators didn't just prepare them for combat, it also turned them into impressive physical specimens that were admired by Roman society. Their muscular builds and battle scars made them objects of fascination and even desire. Some wealthy Roman women were known to pay handsomely for secret liaisons with famous gladiators, adding another layer of danger and excitement to the gladiator's life. As we conclude our exploration of gladiatorial training, it's clear that the life of a Roman gladiator was far from glamorous. The constant physical strain, the ever-present risk of injury or death, and the loss of personal freedom made it a challenging existence. Yet for many, the allure of fame, the thrill of combat, and the chance to rise from obscurity to become a celebrated hero of the arena made it a risk worth taking. In many ways, the gladiators embodied the Roman ideals of discipline, courage, and the pursuit of glory, even in the face of death. As we sail away from the pirate-infested waters, let's journey back in time to ancient Rome, where we'll explore the daily lives of gladiators. These iconic fighters have captured our imaginations for centuries, but the reality of their existence was far from glamorous. Contrary to popular belief, not all gladiators were slaves or prisoners. Some were actually volunteers who saw gladiatorial combat as a path to fame and fortune. However, regardless of their origins, all gladiators lived under strict rules and endured grueling routines. A typical day for a gladiator began at dawn. They would wake up in their cramped living quarters, often shared with dozens of other fighters. These ludus, or gladiator schools, were more like prisons than modern sports academies. The morning would start with a hearty breakfast. Gladiators were known as barley men due to their high-carb vegetarian diet. This might seem counterintuitive for warriors, but there was method to this madness. The diet was designed to build a layer of protective fat to make wounds less deadly and create a more impressive spectacle when they were cut. After breakfast, gladiators would begin their intense training regimen. This included strength training, weapons practice, and combat drills. They would often train with wooden weapons that were heavier than their metal counterparts to build strength and endurance. Midday would bring a break for lunch, again focusing on grains and vegetables. Meat was a rarity, reserved for special occasions or as a reward for exceptional performance. Afternoon training sessions were equally grueling. Gladiators would practice specific fighting techniques, study tactics, and engage in mock battles. These sessions were overseen by a lanista, a former gladiator who now served as a trainer and manager. Injuries were common during training, and gladiators had access to some of the best medical care in the Roman world. After all, they were valuable assets, and it was in the lanista's interest to keep them healthy and fighting fit. As evening approached, gladiators would clean up and receive massages to soothe their aching muscles. Dinner was another simple affair, followed by rest and recovery. Some gladiators used this time to socialize, gamble, or even pursue romantic relationships, though these were often discouraged. Gladiators didn't fight every day. In fact, they might only enter the arena a few times a year. The rest of their time was spent in constant preparation for these moments of truth. On the eve of a fight, gladiators would be treated to a lavish last meal. This was partly for their enjoyment, but also served as a morbid attraction for wealthy Romans who would pay to attend these banquets and gawk at the men who might die for their entertainment the next day. The day of combat brought a mix of dread and excitement. Gladiators would prepare their bodies and minds, often praying to the gods for protection. They would don their armor, which was designed more for spectacle than practicality, and march into the arena to the roar of the crowd. Contrary to popular belief, gladiatorial combats weren't always to the death. Many fights ended when one gladiator admitted defeat, though the final decision often rested with the crowd or the emperor. Successful gladiators could win not only their lives but also fame and prizes. For those who survived and excelled, there was the possibility of earning their freedom. A gladiator who had served for 3 to 5 years could be awarded a wooden sword, symbolizing their release from service. Some even went on to become trainers themselves or open their own gladiator schools. However, the life of a gladiator was undeniably harsh. Many died young, either in combat or from injuries and diseases contracted in the unsanitary conditions of the ludus. The constant threat of death, the physical toll of training, and the psychological stress of their profession made for a difficult existence. Despite these hardships, gladiators held a unique place in Roman society. They were simultaneously despised as lowly entertainers and revered as heroes. Their images appeared on everything from mosaics to lamps, and their exploits were celebrated in poetry and prose. As we drift off to sleep, imagine the complex world of the gladiator. The clash of steel, the roar of the crowd, the daily grind of training, all set against the backdrop of ancient Rome. It's a far cry from the glamorized version we often see in movies, but no less fascinating for its gritty reality. As we sail away from the treacherous waters of piracy, let's journey back in time to ancient Rome, where another group of individuals faced their own perilous existence, the gladiators. While Hollywood has romanticized these warriors, the reality of gladiatorial life was far from glamorous. Gladiators were often slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals forced to fight for their lives in the arena. Contrary to popular belief, not all battles ended in death, but the constant threat loomed over every contest. Training to become a gladiator was brutal and unforgiving. At gladiatorial schools, or ludi, trainees endured grueling physical conditioning and weapons training. The daily regimen was designed to build strength, agility, and combat skills, but it also served to strip away individuality and create obedient fighters. Diet played a crucial role in a gladiator's life. Known as barley men due to their high-carbohydrate diet, gladiators consumed meals rich in beans and grains. This diet was intended to build a layer of protective fat, which would allow for visually impressive, but not immediately lethal, wounds during combat. The types of gladiators were diverse, each with their own specialized weapons and armor. The Murmillo, for instance, wielded a large rectangular shield and a short sword, while the Retiarius fought with a net and trident. These varying styles created intriguing matchups for spectators, but added layers of complexity and danger for the fighters themselves. Contrary to the thumbs-up, thumbs-down myth perpetuated by modern media, the fate of a defeated gladiator was often more nuanced. The editor of the games, usually a high-ranking official or even the emperor, would consider factors such as the fighter's performance, the crowd's reaction, and the cost of replacing a skilled gladiator before deciding their fate. While some gladiators did achieve fame and even wealth, the vast majority lived short, brutal lives. The average career span of a gladiator was just 2 to 3 years, with many dying in their early 20s. Even those who survived faced a myriad of health issues from repeated injuries and the intense physical strain of their profession. One aspect often overlooked is the psychological toll of gladiatorial life. These men, and sometimes women, lived with the constant knowledge that each day could be their last. The stress of impending combat, coupled with the trauma of witnessing the deaths of fellow gladiators, would have been immense. Gladiators also faced social stigma. Despite their popularity as entertainers, they were considered infamies, people of bad reputation. This status placed them on the lowest rungs of Roman society, alongside actors and prostitutes. Even successful gladiators who won their freedom often struggled to integrate back into regular society. The gladiatorial games themselves were a complex spectacle, far more than simple one-on-one duels. A typical day at the Colosseum would begin with animal hunts, followed by executions of criminals, and only then would the gladiatorial combats commence. This progression of events was designed to build anticipation and bloodlust in the audience. One particularly gruesome aspect of the games was the use of condemned criminals in recreations of mythological scenes. These unfortunate individuals would be forced to act out roles that inevitably ended in their deaths, often in horrifically creative ways to match the myths being portrayed. While we often think of gladiators fighting other gladiators, they were also pitted against wild animals. These bestiae faced lions, tigers, bears, and other exotic beasts imported from across the empire. Such contests were even more unpredictable and dangerous than human opponents. The medical care available to gladiators was surprisingly advanced for its time. Specialized doctors were on hand during fights to treat injuries, and archaeological evidence suggests that some gladiators survived and healed from wounds that would have been fatal to the average person. However, this medical expertise was driven more by the economic value of gladiators than humanitarian concerns. As the Roman Empire began to decline, so too did the gladiatorial games. The spread of Christianity, with its emphasis on the sanctity of human life, contributed to changing attitudes towards the games. Emperor Constantine banned gladiatorial contests in 325 CE, although they continued in some form until the late 5th century. The legacy of gladiators extends far beyond their time. Their image has been used throughout history to symbolize courage, strength, and the struggle against adversity. However, it's crucial to remember the reality behind the myth: lives of hardship, violence, and often tragically short duration. As we reflect on the lives of these ancient warriors, we're reminded of the complex nature of human societies and the often brutal forms of entertainment that have existed throughout history. The gladiatorial games serve as a stark reminder of how far we've come, and perhaps how far we still have to go in valuing human life and dignity. As we conclude our exploration of ancient Roman gladiators, let's reflect on the complex legacy they've left behind. These warriors, both feared and revered, have become enduring symbols of Roman culture and spectacle. Despite the romanticized image we often have of gladiators, their lives were far from glamorous. The majority were slaves or prisoners of war, forced into a life of violence and uncertainty. Even those who volunteered, often desperate individuals seeking fame or fortune, faced a grim reality once they entered the ludus or gladiator school. Training was brutal and unforgiving. Gladiators endured grueling physical conditioning, learned complex fighting techniques, and were subjected to strict diets designed to build muscle mass. Their entire existence revolved around preparing for the moment they would step into the arena, where life and death hung in the balance. Yet despite these harsh conditions, some gladiators did achieve a level of celebrity status. The most skilled and charismatic fighters could amass wealth, earn their freedom, and even become household names. Graffiti found in Pompeii reveals that some gladiators had devoted fan bases, much like modern-day athletes. However, we must remember that for every success story, countless others met tragic ends. The average life expectancy for a gladiator was remarkably low, with many perishing in their mid-20s. The constant threat of death or severe injury loomed over every match, making each day a potential last. The gladiatorial games themselves were a reflection of Roman society's values and power structures. They served as a means of political propaganda, demonstrating the emperor's generosity and control over life and death. The games also reinforced social hierarchies, with the elite watching from privileged positions while the masses crowded together in the upper tiers. Interestingly, the relationship between gladiators and Roman citizens was multifaceted. While they were often viewed as expendable entertainment, gladiators also embodied virtues that Romans admired: courage, skill, and the ability to face death with dignity. This paradox highlights the complex nature of Roman society and its attitudes towards violence and spectacle. As the Roman Empire began to decline, so too did the popularity of gladiatorial combat. The rise of Christianity, with its emphasis on compassion and the sanctity of human life, contributed to growing opposition to the games. Emperor Constantine banned gladiatorial fights in 325 CE, although they continued in some form until the late 5th century. Today, gladiators continue to captivate our imagination, featuring prominently in films, books, and popular culture. However, it's crucial to separate the romanticized depictions from the harsh historical reality. These were not just entertaining fighters, but individuals caught in a system that often exploited and dehumanized them. In studying gladiators, we gain insight not only into ancient Roman society, but also into our own relationship with violence and entertainment. The enduring fascination with gladiators prompts us to question how societies throughout history have blurred the lines between spectacle and brutality. As we move forward in our historical journey, let's carry with us the complex legacy of the gladiators. Their story serves as a reminder of the depths of human cruelty, the heights of physical prowess, and the intricate ways in which societies construct and consume entertainment. In understanding their world, we gain a deeper appreciation for the progress we've made and the ethical questions we still grapple with today. As we drift away from the treacherous world of piracy, let's set sail for another intriguing chapter of history. Our next destination takes us to a time of grand palaces, opulent lifestyles, and surprising hygiene practices. Prepare to discover why it wasn't always glamorous to be royalty in medieval Europe. As we sail away from the tumultuous seas of piracy, let's dock our ship in the muddy fields of medieval Europe. Our next journey takes us to the life of the medieval peasant, an existence so mundane and difficult that it might just lull you into a peaceful slumber. Welcome to the third chapter of our boring history lesson, Medieval Peasant Life. Picture, if you will, a world without smartphones, indoor plumbing, or even basic hygiene. A world where your daily routine revolves around backbreaking labor, meager meals, and the constant threat of disease. This was the reality for the vast majority of people living in medieval Europe, particularly the peasants who formed the backbone of feudal society. But before we delve into the nitty-gritty details of peasant life, let's set the stage. The medieval period, also known as the Middle Ages, stretched roughly from the 5th to the 15th century. It was a time of castles, knights, and rigid social hierarchies. At the bottom of this hierarchy were the peasants, who made up about 90% of the population. Now you might be wondering, what exactly is a peasant? Well, in medieval terms, a peasant was essentially a poor farmer who worked on land owned by wealthy nobles or the church. They were tied to the land they worked, often unable to leave without permission from their lord. This system, known as serfdom, was a form of indentured servitude that kept peasants in a cycle of poverty and obligation. Let's start our day as a medieval peasant. The rooster crows, signaling the break of dawn. You rise from your straw mattress, which you share with your entire family and possibly a few livestock for warmth. Your one-room mud and straw hut is dark and smoky from last night's fire. There's no time to linger in bed, though. The fields won't plow themselves. As you step outside, the crisp morning air fills your lungs. It's probably the cleanest thing you'll experience all day. Your bare feet sink into the muddy ground as you make your way to the communal outhouse. Privacy, that's a luxury reserved for the nobility. Here, you'll do your business alongside your neighbors, swatting away flies and trying not to breathe too deeply. With nature's call answered, it's time for breakfast, but don't get too excited. Your morning meal consists of a chunk of dark bread and perhaps some watery ale. If you're lucky, you might have a bit of cheese or an egg. Meat is a rare treat, usually reserved for special occasions or when an animal is too old to work. Suitably nourished, or at least no longer starving, you head out to the fields. The sun is barely up, but there's work to be done. Depending on the season, you might be plowing, sowing, weeding, or harvesting. The tools at your disposal are rudimentary at best: wooden plows, scythes, and your own two hands. As you toil under the hot sun, your back aching and hands blistered, you might wonder about the fruits of your labor. Surely, with all this hard work, you must be producing quite a lot of food. And you'd be right. However, a significant portion of your harvest doesn't belong to you. Instead, it goes to your lord as rent for the land you work and live on. This system, known as the manorial system, ensures that peasants remain in a constant state of near subsistence. But it's not all work and no play in the life of a medieval peasant. Well, actually, it mostly is, but there are some breaks in the monotony. Sundays are generally reserved for rest and attending church services. The church plays a central role in peasant life, providing not just spiritual guidance, but also serving as a community center and source of charity. Throughout the year, there are also various religious festivals and feast days that offer a respite from the daily grind. These celebrations often involve communal meals, dancing, and games. It's during these times that you might actually get to enjoy some of that meat you've been eyeing all year. As the day wears on, you return from the fields, exhausted but not done yet. There are still animals to tend to, repairs to make, and other household chores to complete. Women, in particular, had a never-ending list of tasks, from cooking and cleaning to spinning wool and caring for children. Speaking of children, they weren't exempt from work either. From a young age, peasant children were expected to contribute to the household. They might help with simple tasks like gathering eggs or herding geese, gradually taking on more responsibilities as they grew older. As night falls, you gather with your family around the hearth. The flickering fire provides the only light in your humble abode. This is a time for storytelling, passing down oral traditions, and perhaps engaging in simple crafts like whittling or mending clothes. Entertainment is homemade and imagination-driven, no Netflix binge-watching for you. Before you drift off to sleep on your lumpy straw mattress, you might reflect on your lot in life. It's hard, no doubt about it, but for most medieval peasants, this was simply the way things were. The concept of social mobility or drastically improving one's circumstances was largely foreign. Your main concerns were surviving, fulfilling your obligations to your lord, and hopefully having enough food to last through the winter. And so, as we leave our medieval peasant to his well-earned rest, we can perhaps appreciate the comforts of our modern lives a little more. The next time you grumble about your morning commute or a slow internet connection, just remember, at least you're not worried about the Lord taking half your crops or catching the plague. In our next segment, we'll delve deeper into the specific aspects of medieval peasant life, exploring their diet, health, and the constant threats they faced from both nature and their fellow humans. But for now, let the monotony of medieval peasant life lull you into a peaceful slumber, free from the worries of crop yields and feudal obligations. As we continue our journey through the most mundane aspects of history, let's turn our attention to the delightfully dull topic of medieval peasant housing. Prepare to be underwhelmed by the living conditions of the common folk during the Middle Ages. Medieval peasants, comprising the vast majority of the population, lived in what can only be described as less than luxurious accommodations. Their homes, if one could call them that, were a far cry from the grand castles and manors of their feudal lords. The typical peasant dwelling was a small, single-room structure known as a cottage. These humble abodes were usually constructed using whatever materials were readily available in the local area. In forested regions, timber-framed houses were common, while in areas with less abundant wood, homes might be built from stone or even turf. Let's delve into the thrilling world of wattle and daub, a popular building technique used by medieval peasants. Wattle involved weaving thin branches or twigs between upright posts to create a framework. This was then covered with daub, a mixture of mud, clay, and straw. The result, a wall that was about as sturdy as it sounds. The roofs of these cottages were typically thatched, using materials like straw, reeds, or heather. While this provided some insulation, it also created the perfect habitat for a variety of pests. Nothing says home sweet home quite like sharing your living space with rats, mice, and insects. Windows, you ask? Well, that's a bit of a luxury. Most peasant homes had few, if any, windows. Those that did exist were small openings, often covered with animal hide or cloth to keep out the elements. Glass was far too expensive for the average peasant, so natural light was a rare commodity inside these dwellings. The floor of a peasant's home was typically made of packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes or straw. This delightful flooring choice meant that cleaning was a constant battle against dirt, dust, and the occasional unwelcome plant growth. Heating and cooking were achieved through a central hearth, which was essentially an open fire in the middle of the room. Smoke would theoretically escape through a hole in the roof, but in reality, it often filled the living space, creating a cozy atmosphere of constant eye irritation and respiratory issues. Let's not forget about the furniture, or rather, the lack thereof. The average peasant home contained little more than a few wooden stools, perhaps a table, and if they were particularly well off, a chest for storage. Beds were often nothing more than straw-filled mattresses placed directly on the floor. Privacy was a concept as foreign to medieval peasants as indoor plumbing. The single-room layout meant that entire families, sometimes including multiple generations, lived, slept, and worked in the same space. Personal space was a luxury reserved for the wealthy. Speaking of plumbing, it's time to address the elephant in the room, or rather, the lack of a room for the elephant. Sanitation in medieval peasant homes was rudimentary at best. Most cottages didn't have dedicated toilet facilities. Instead, people would use chamber pots or simply step outside to relieve themselves. For those lucky enough to have a separate structure for their sanitary needs, the outhouse was a marvel of medieval engineering. These were typically small wooden sheds positioned over a pit, providing a slightly more dignified option for answering nature's call. Water for drinking and cooking was usually collected from nearby streams, wells, or springs. The concept of clean, potable water straight from a tap was centuries away. Instead, peasants enjoyed the daily adventure of wondering whether their water would make them ill. Let's not overlook the charming addition of livestock to the medieval peasant home. It wasn't uncommon for families to share their living space with animals, particularly during harsh winter months. Nothing says cozy quite like bedding down next to your chickens or goats. The size of these cottages was, to put it mildly, compact. With an average floor space of around 500 to 700 square feet, medieval peasant homes made modern studio apartments look positively palatial. This limited space had to accommodate not just living areas, but also work areas for various household industries. Maintenance of these homes was an ongoing challenge. The organic materials used in construction were prone to decay, requiring frequent repairs. Thatched roofs needed to be replaced every few years, and the wattle and daub walls required regular patching and replastering. During winter, the inadequacies of peasant housing became glaringly apparent. The poorly insulated walls and roofs did little to keep out the cold, and the single hearth struggled to warm the entire space. Huddling around the fire became less of a cozy family activity and more of a survival strategy. Summer brought its own set of challenges. The lack of ventilation meant that the interior of these homes could become stiflingly hot. The thatched roof, while somewhat effective against rain, did little to regulate temperature, turning the cottage into something of a primitive sauna. It's worth noting that not all peasant homes were created equal. Those of slightly higher status, such as village craftsmen or more prosperous farmers, might have enjoyed slightly larger dwellings or even the luxury of a second room. However, for the vast majority, the single-room cottage was the norm. As we near the end of our riveting exploration of medieval peasant housing, let's reflect on the stark contrast between these humble dwellings and the grand castles and cathedrals that often dominate our perception of medieval architecture. While the nobility lived in relative comfort, the vast majority of the population endured living conditions that we would consider barely habitable by modern standards. Yet it's important to remember that for medieval peasants, these homes, however humble, were more than just shelter. They were the center of family life, the place where generations were born, lived, and died. Despite their many shortcomings, these cottages were, for better or worse, home. As we continue our journey through the mundane aspects of history, let's turn our attention to the daily life of medieval peasants, focusing specifically on their food and diet. Prepare yourself for a bland exploration of the unappetizing world of medieval cuisine. In the Middle Ages, the diet of peasants was far from the lavish feasts we might imagine when thinking of medieval times. Instead, their meals were simple, repetitive, and often lacking in both flavor and nutrition. The staple food for most peasants was bread. However, this wasn't the soft, fluffy bread we enjoy today. Medieval peasant bread was often made from lower quality grains like rye or barley, resulting in a dense, coarse loaf that was difficult to chew and even harder to digest. To make matters worse, the bread was frequently stretched with fillers like ground acorns or even sawdust to make it last longer. This practice not only affected the taste, but also reduced the nutritional value of their primary food source. Peasants would typically consume this bread in the form of a pottage, a thick soup or stew made by boiling whatever vegetables were available in water. Common ingredients included beans, peas, onions, and if they were lucky, some root vegetables like turnips or carrots. Meat was a rare luxury for most peasants. They might occasionally have access to pork from pigs they raised, but beef and other meats were generally reserved for the wealthy. Instead, peasants often relied on eggs from their chickens or small game they could catch, such as rabbits or squirrels. Fish was more common in coastal areas or near rivers, but for inland peasants, it was usually limited to special occasions or religious fasting days when meat was prohibited. Speaking of religious fasting, the medieval calendar was filled with days when certain foods were restricted. During Lent, for example, peasants had to abstain from meat, dairy, and eggs for 40 days, further limiting their already meager diet. Dairy products like milk and cheese were available to some extent, but fresh milk was often reserved for making cheese or butter, as it spoiled quickly without refrigeration. Cheese became an important source of protein and calories for peasants, though it was often of poor quality compared to what we're used to today. Fruits were seasonal and limited. Apples, pears, and berries might be available during certain times of the year, but they weren't a regular part of the peasant diet. Many fruits were instead used to make ale or cider, which were safer to drink than water in many cases. Speaking of drinks, ale was the most common beverage for peasants. Water sources were often contaminated, and the process of brewing ale helped kill harmful bacteria. However, this medieval ale was far weaker than modern beer and was consumed by people of all ages, including children. The monotony of the peasant diet was occasionally broken by festivals or harvest times when more varied foods might be available. However, these were rare bright spots in an otherwise dull culinary landscape. Cooking methods were limited and basic. Most peasant homes had a single hearth fire for both heating and cooking. Food was typically boiled or roasted, with little variation in preparation methods. Spices, which we take for granted today, were expensive luxuries far beyond the reach of the average peasant. The lack of variety and proper nutrition in the peasant diet often led to health problems. Deficiencies in vitamins and minerals were common, leading to conditions like scurvy, rickets, and anemia. The high consumption of bread and ale, combined with poor dental hygiene, also resulted in widespread tooth decay and gum disease. During times of poor harvest or famine, the situation became even more dire. Peasants might resort to eating bark, grass, or even clay to stave off hunger. These desperate measures often led to illness and malnutrition, further weakening an already vulnerable population. The medieval period also saw the rise of the three-field system of crop rotation, which somewhat improved agricultural yields. However, the benefits of this system were often reaped by landowners rather than the peasants themselves, who continued to subsist on a minimal diet. It's worth noting that the diet of peasants varied somewhat depending on the region and climate. Those living in Mediterranean areas, for instance, might have had access to olives and olive oil, while those in northern Europe relied more heavily on animal fats like lard. The monotony of the peasant diet was not just a matter of limited ingredients, but also of limited cooking utensils and methods. Most peasant households had only a single pot for cooking, which meant that meals were often one-pot affairs, with little variation in texture or presentation. Preservation of food was a constant challenge for medieval peasants. Without modern refrigeration, they relied on methods like salting, smoking, and pickling to keep food from spoiling. These preservation techniques, while necessary, often further diminish the flavor and nutritional value of their already limited food options. The concept of balanced nutrition was, of course, unknown in medieval times. Peasants ate what was available and filling, with little understanding of the long-term health impacts of their diet. This lack of nutritional knowledge, combined with the limited food options, contributed to the generally short life expectancy of the medieval peasant population. In conclusion, the food and diet of medieval peasants were characterized by monotony, scarcity, and a lack of variety that we would find hard to imagine today. Their daily struggle for sustenance was a far cry from the romanticized feasts often depicted in popular media about the Middle Ages. As we drift off to sleep, let's be grateful for the abundance and variety of food options we have in the modern world, a luxury that medieval peasants could only dream of. As we delve into the third topic of our sleep-inducing journey through boring history, let's explore the monotonous and laborious life of medieval peasants, focusing on their work and labor. Prepare to be lulled into a peaceful slumber as we recount the tedious details of their daily toil. Medieval peasant life was centered around agricultural work, which dominated their existence from sunrise to sunset. The vast majority of the population, around 90%, lived in rural areas and worked the land. Their lives were dictated by the changing seasons and the relentless demands of feudal lords. The peasants' day typically began before dawn, as they rose with the first light to maximize the daylight hours for work. Their modest homes, often just one-room structures with thatched roofs and dirt floors, provided little comfort as they prepared for another day of backbreaking labor. The primary occupation for most peasants was farming. They cultivated crops such as wheat, barley, oats, and rye, which formed the staple diet of medieval society. The agricultural calendar was divided into distinct periods, each with its own set of tasks and challenges. In spring, peasants would begin by preparing the soil for planting. This involved the arduous task of plowing fields using rudimentary tools like wooden plows pulled by oxen or horses. The process was slow and physically demanding, requiring immense strength and endurance. Once the fields were plowed, seeds were sown by hand. Peasants would walk up and down the furrows, scattering seeds from bags slung over their shoulders. This method was imprecise and often resulted in uneven crop growth, but it was the best available technique at the time. As summer approached, peasants turned their attention to maintaining the growing crops. This involved endless hours of weeding, a monotonous task that required constant bending and stooping. They also had to protect their crops from pests and wild animals, often spending nights in the fields to scare away potential threats. The height of summer brought the hay harvest, a crucial time for securing winter feed for livestock. Peasants would use scythes to cut the grass, then rake it into piles to dry. This process was time-sensitive, as rain could easily spoil the hay, rendering their efforts useless. Autumn was perhaps the busiest season for medieval peasants. The grain harvest demanded all hands on deck, with entire families working from dawn to dusk. Men would use sickles to cut the grain, while women and children followed behind, gathering and binding the sheaves. After the harvest, the grain needed to be threshed to separate the edible kernels from the inedible chaff. This was done by beating the sheaves with flails on a hard surface, a repetitive and physically taxing process that could last for weeks. Winter brought a slight reprieve from field work, but peasants were far from idle. This season was dedicated to repairing tools, mending fences, and tending to livestock. They also engaged in various crafts, such as spinning wool, weaving cloth, and making baskets to supplement their meager income. Throughout the year, peasants were also responsible for maintaining the lord's domain, the portion of land directly controlled by the feudal lord. This often involved additional labor on top of their own farming duties, further stretching their already limited time and energy. The medieval agricultural system operated on a three-field rotation, where 1/3 of the land was left fallow each year to restore soil fertility. This practice, while beneficial for long-term productivity, meant that peasants had to carefully manage their limited resources to ensure sufficient food production. In addition to crop cultivation, many peasants also raised livestock. Cattle, sheep, pigs, and poultry were common on medieval farms. Tending to these animals was a daily responsibility that included feeding, cleaning, and general care. Sheep, in particular, were valuable for their wool, which could be sold or used to make clothing. The tools used by medieval peasants were simple and often inefficient by modern standards. Wooden plows, handheld sickles, and flails were the primary implements for field work. These tools required constant maintenance and repair, adding yet another task to the peasants' long list of responsibilities. Beyond agriculture, peasants engaged in various other forms of labor to support their communities and fulfill their obligations to their lords. This could include construction work, such as building and repairing roads, bridges, and fortifications. Some peasants also worked as blacksmiths, carpenters, or millers, providing essential services to their fellow villagers. The concept of leisure time was largely foreign to medieval peasants. Their lives were consumed by work, with little opportunity for rest or recreation. The few moments of respite they enjoyed were often tied to religious observances, such as Sundays and holy days, when work was prohibited. Despite their ceaseless toil, medieval peasants lived in a state of near constant poverty. The majority of their produce went to pay rent to their lords or as tithes to the church. What little remained was barely enough to sustain their families, leaving them perpetually on the brink of hunger and hardship. The harsh realities of peasant labor were further compounded by the ever-present threat of crop failure due to adverse weather conditions, pest infestations, or disease. A single poor harvest could spell disaster for entire communities, leading to widespread famine and suffering. As we conclude this segment on medieval peasant work and labor, we can appreciate the stark contrast between their lives and our modern existence. The relentless cycle of agricultural tasks, the physical demands of manual labor, and the constant struggle for survival define the peasant experience for centuries. Their monotonous and grueling work serves as a poignant reminder of how far society has progressed, and perhaps, as we drift off to sleep, we can find gratitude in the comforts and opportunities of our present-day lives. As we conclude our exploration of medieval peasant life, let's reflect on the harsh realities these individuals faced daily. Their existence was a constant struggle against poverty, disease, and oppression, with little hope for improvement. Peasants lived in a world where social mobility was virtually non-existent. The feudal system, which dominated medieval society, ensured that those born into peasantry would likely remain there for life. This rigid social structure meant that peasants had little to no control over their own destinies. The concept of personal freedom, as we understand it today, was foreign to medieval peasants. They were bound to the land they worked, often unable to leave without permission from their lords. This lack of autonomy extended to many aspects of their lives, including marriage and family planning. Education was a luxury far beyond the reach of most peasants. Illiteracy was widespread, with only a small fraction of the population able to read or write. This lack of education further limited their opportunities and reinforced their low social status. The medieval diet for peasants was monotonous and often insufficient. Their meals primarily consisted of bread, pottage, a thick soup made from vegetables and grains, and occasionally small amounts of meat or fish. Malnutrition was common, weakening their bodies and making them more susceptible to diseases. Speaking of diseases, the lack of proper sanitation and medical knowledge made peasants particularly vulnerable to outbreaks. The Black Death, which ravaged Europe in the 14th century, hit peasant communities especially hard, decimating entire villages and further destabilizing their already precarious lives. Religion played a central role in peasant life, offering both comfort and control. The church was a powerful institution that dominated much of medieval society, and peasants were expected to adhere to its teachings and practices. While faith provided solace in difficult times, it also reinforced the social hierarchy and the idea that one's lot in life was divinely ordained. The concept of leisure time as we know it today was virtually non-existent for medieval peasants. Their days were filled with backbreaking labor from dawn to dusk, with only religious holidays offering brief respites from their toil. Even these moments of respite were often filled with obligations to the church or local community. It's important to note that while life for medieval peasants was undoubtedly harsh, they did develop ways to cope with their circumstances. Strong community bonds, local traditions, and occasional festivities provided moments of joy and solidarity in an otherwise difficult existence. As we conclude this segment on medieval peasant life, we're reminded of how far human society has progressed. The struggles and hardships faced by these individuals have shaped the course of history, contributing to the gradual erosion of feudalism and the eventual rise of more egalitarian social structures. While we may romanticize certain aspects of medieval life in popular culture, the reality for the vast majority of people during this period was far from glamorous. It was a life of constant toil, uncertainty, and limited opportunities. Yet it's through understanding these historical realities that we can better appreciate the progress we've made and the challenges we still face in creating a more just and equitable world. As we sail away from the treacherous world of piracy, let's dock our ship of knowledge at another fascinating port in history. Our next destination takes us from the high seas to the bustling streets of ancient civilizations. Prepare to journey back in time as we explore why it wasn't always glamorous to be a citizen in some of the world's most renowned empires. As we sail away from the treacherous waters of piracy, let's journey back in time to the sun-baked lands of ancient Egypt. Our next topic explores the lives of those who toiled under the scorching sun, building monuments that would stand the test of time. Welcome to the world of ancient Egyptian workers, where we'll discover why their daily grind might have been just as challenging as life on the high seas. Picture this: the year is around 2500 BCE, and you're not a pharaoh or a high priest, but an ordinary Egyptian worker. Your alarm clock, the first rays of the sun peeking over the horizon. No snooze button here, folks. It's time to get up and face another day of backbreaking labor. Now you might be thinking, hey, at least they got to build cool pyramids. Well, let me tell you, it wasn't all about glamorous monument construction. The vast majority of ancient Egyptian workers were farmers, toiling in the fields along the Nile River. Their lives revolved around the river's annual flood cycle, which determined their entire agricultural calendar. Imagine waking up every day to the same routine, trudging through mud, plowing fields with primitive tools, and constantly battling the unforgiving desert heat. When you thought your morning commute was rough, these farmers didn't have the luxury of air conditioning or even a cool glass of lemonade to refresh themselves. But wait, there's more. The ancient Egyptian government wasn't exactly known for its worker-friendly policies. Taxes were a constant burden, and not paying them could result in severe punishment. Picture this: you've spent months growing your crops, only to have a significant portion taken away by the state. Talk about a buzzkill. Now let's not forget about the skilled craftsmen and artisans. While they might have had slightly better working conditions than farmers, their lives weren't exactly a walk in the park either. These workers were often organized into guilds and lived in planned communities near their workplaces. Sounds cozy, right? Well, not quite. These communities were essentially ancient versions of company towns where every aspect of a worker's life was controlled by their employer. Privacy, personal time, those were luxuries they could only dream of. And speaking of dreams, let's talk about the ultimate dream job in ancient Egypt, being a scribe. These were the educated elite who could read and write hieroglyphics. Sounds pretty cushy, doesn't it? Well, hold your horses, because becoming a scribe was no walk in the park. Scribe school was brutally competitive and rigorous. Students spent years memorizing thousands of hieroglyphic symbols and mastering complex mathematical calculations. And if you thought your school exams were tough, imagine the pressure of knowing that your entire future depended on your ability to write perfectly and calculate accurately. But hey, at least they got to sit in the shade, right? Well, sure, if you consider hunching over papyrus for hours on end, squinting in dim light, and developing chronic back pain a cushy job. Plus, as a scribe, you were often responsible for recording tax collections and supervising building projects. Talk about a stressful office job. Now let's address the elephant in the room, or should I say, the pyramid in the desert. Yes, some workers were involved in the construction of those massive monuments we all know and love, but contrary to popular belief, these weren't slaves toiling under the whip. Archaeological evidence suggests that many pyramid builders were actually skilled workers who took pride in their craft. However, don't start thinking it was all sunshine and sphinx statues. These construction projects were incredibly dangerous. Imagine hauling massive limestone blocks up ramps in the blistering heat, with the constant risk of accidents. OSHA would have had a field day if they existed back then. And let's not forget about the living conditions for these workers. They often lived in temporary camps near the construction sites, which were about as comfortable as you'd expect a desert camp to be. Think cramped quarters, limited sanitation, and a menu that consisted mainly of bread, beer, and onions. Not exactly a five-star resort, is it? Speaking of food, let's talk about the ancient Egyptian diet. For most workers, it was a monotonous affair. The staple foods were bread and beer, supplemented with vegetables like onions and garlic. Meat was a rare luxury, usually reserved for special occasions or the upper classes. So if you're a foodie, ancient Egypt might not have been your ideal vacation spot. But wait, there's more. Remember those farmers we talked about earlier? Well, their work wasn't just physically demanding, it was also incredibly time-sensitive. The entire agricultural cycle depended on the annual flooding of the Nile. Miss the right time to plant or harvest, and you could be looking at a year of famine. And if you thought your boss was demanding, imagine working for a pharaoh who believed himself to be a living god. Talk about pressure to perform. The belief in the divine right of kings meant that disobeying orders or slacking off wasn't just frowned upon, it could be seen as sacrilege. Now you might be wondering about healthcare in ancient Egypt. After all, they were known for their advanced medical knowledge, right? Well, yes and no. While Egyptian doctors were indeed ahead of their time in many ways, most workers probably couldn't afford their services. Instead, they relied on a combination of folk remedies and prayers to the gods. Got a toothache? Here, chew on this herb and hope for the best. And let's not forget about the constant threat of disease. With limited understanding of germ theory and sanitation, epidemics could spread like wildfire through worker communities. Malaria, tuberculosis, and parasitic infections were common afflictions. So, if you managed to avoid workplace accidents, you still had to contend with a host of invisible enemies. But surely they must have had some time off, right? Well, yes, but probably not in the way you're imagining. Religious festivals were the main form of respite from daily labor. However, these weren't exactly relaxing affairs. They often involved elaborate rituals, processions, and offerings to the gods. So your day off might involve carrying a heavy statue of a deity through the streets under the scorching sun. Not exactly a lazy Sunday brunch, is it? In conclusion, while the life of an ancient Egyptian worker might seem exotic and fascinating from our modern perspective, the reality was far from glamorous. It was a life of constant toil, limited opportunities, and numerous health risks. So the next time you're tempted to complain about your 9-to-5 job, just remember, at least you're not hauling limestone blocks up a pyramid ramp in 100-degree heat. As we sail through the annals of history, let's dock our ship in ancient Egypt, where we'll explore the daily lives of the workers who built one of the world's most enduring civilizations. Prepare to be lulled into a peaceful slumber by the monotonous routines of these ancient laborers. Our journey begins in the pre-dawn hours as the first rays of Ra, the sun god, peek over the horizon. The workers of ancient Egypt, from farmers to craftsmen, would already be stirring. 000030, let's start with the backbone of Egyptian society, the farmers. These hardworking individuals would rise before the sun, their days dictated by the ebb and flow of the Nile. During the inundation season, when the river flooded, farmers would spend their time repairing tools, working on community projects, or serving on corvée labor for the pharaoh's grand constructions. 000115, when the floods receded, the real work began. Farmers would trudge through the newly deposited silt, plowing the fields with simple wooden plows pulled by oxen. The monotony of their days was broken only by the occasional shout to urge on their beasts of burden. 000145, planting season brought its own tedium. Workers would shuffle along bent double, methodically dropping seeds into furrows. This back-breaking work continued from sunrise to sunset, day after day, until all fields were sown. 000215, as crops grew, farmers engaged in the endless task of irrigation. They would operate shadoofs, simple machines consisting of a long pole with a bucket on one end and a counterweight on the other. Hour after hour, they dip the bucket into canals and raise it to water the crops, the repetitive motion a lullaby of labor. 000300, let's shift our gaze to the craftsmen, whose lives were equally routine. Stone workers, for instance, would spend their days in quarries, chipping away at massive blocks of limestone or granite. The constant tap-tap-tap of their copper chisels against stone created a soothing rhythm that echoed through the desert air. 000330, these blocks, once cut, needed to be transported. This involved teams of workers pulling massive stone slabs on wooden rollers. Progress was agonizingly slow, with teams inching forward under the scorching Egyptian sun, their movements synchronized to the beat of a taskmaster's drum. 000400, in the workshops of ancient Egypt, other craftsmen plied their trades. Potters sat at their wheels, feet pumping steadily as they shaped clay into vessels of all sizes. The whir of the potter's wheel and the squelch of wet clay created a white noise that could easily lull one to sleep. 000430, nearby, weavers worked at their looms, the shuttle flying back and forth in a hypnotic dance. The rhythmic clack-clack-clack of the loom filled the air, a monotonous melody accompanying the creation of fine linen garments. 0000500. Let's not forget the scribes, those educated elite who kept the machinery of Egyptian bureaucracy running smoothly. Their days were spent hunched over papyrus scrolls, meticulously recording inventories, tax collections, and religious texts. The scratch of reed pens on papyrus and the gentle grinding of pigments for ink provided a soothing backdrop to their tedious tasks. 000545. As the day wore on, workers would pause for a simple meal. This typically consisted of bread, the staple of the Egyptian diet, perhaps accompanied by some onions or garlic. The grinding of grain for bread was itself a time-consuming and monotonous task, usually performed by women using stone querns. 000615. After their brief respite, it was back to work. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, but the labor continued unabated. Farmers tended their crops, craftsmen shaped their wares, and construction workers heaved massive stones into place, all under the watchful eyes of overseers. 000645. For those working on the pharaoh's grand projects like the pyramids or temples, life was particularly grueling. These workers lived in purpose-built villages near the construction sites, their lives entirely devoted to the task at hand. Day after day, year after year, they would perform the same backbreaking labor, slowly but surely erecting monuments that would stand for millennia. 000730. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, workers would begin to wrap up their daily tasks. Farmers would lead their oxen back to shelter, craftsmen would clean and store their tools, and construction workers would trudge back to their living quarters. 000800. The evening brought little respite. Many workers would spend their free time performing household chores, repairing tools, or preparing for the next day's labor. Some might gather to share stories or play simple games, but the specter of another day's toil always loomed. 000830. As night fell, most workers would retire to their simple dwellings. These were often one-room mud brick structures, hot and stuffy, with reed mats for beds. Sleep came quickly to these exhausted laborers, their dreams perhaps filled with visions of the endless tasks that awaited them at dawn. 000900. And so the cycle would begin anew with the rising sun, each day a carbon copy of the last, as the workers of ancient Egypt slowly built a civilization that would fascinate the world for millennia to come. Their lives, while monotonous, were the foundation upon which the glory of Egypt was built, a testament to the power of steady, unchanging routine. As we drift further into the annals of history, let's turn our attention to the land of the pharaohs, where the great pyramids still stand as testament to ancient ingenuity. But what was life really like for the workers who built these monumental structures? Contrary to popular belief, it wasn't all about whips and slaves. Let's explore why being an ancient Egyptian worker during pyramid construction was far from glamorous, yet not quite as dire as Hollywood might have you believe. First, let's address the elephant in the room, or should I say, the mummy in the tomb. The workers who built the pyramids weren't slaves. Archaeological evidence suggests they were paid laborers, often farmers who worked on the pyramids during the annual Nile flood when their fields were submerged. While this might sound like a pleasant change of pace, don't be fooled. Their lives were still incredibly challenging. Imagine waking up at dawn not to the gentle chirping of birds, but to the harsh sound of a copper gong. You'd roll out of your simple reed mat, your back already aching from yesterday's labor. Your breakfast, a chunk of bread, some onions, and if you're lucky, a bit of fish from the Nile. Not exactly a balanced meal to fuel a day of heavy lifting. As you trudge to the construction site, the sun begins to rise, promising another scorching day in the desert. The average temperature during the building season could reach up to 95 degrees F, 35 degrees C. There's no air conditioning, no cold drinks, just the relentless heat beating down on your skin, already leathery from constant exposure. Now you might think at least they had advanced tools to make the work easier. Well, think again. The tools used were incredibly primitive by today's standards. Copper chisels and bronze saws, granite hammers, and wooden rollers and sleds. Imagine trying to cut through limestone with a copper chisel. It's like trying to slice a steak with a butter knife, possible but incredibly time-consuming and frustrating. Let's talk about the actual work. If you were lucky, you might be assigned to quarry stone blocks. This involved using those copper chisels and bronze saws to cut limestone into blocks weighing anywhere from 2.5 to 15 tons. Doesn't sound too bad. Well, consider that you'd be doing this for hours on end, in a quarry where limestone dust filled the air, coating your lungs and making every breath a struggle. If quarrying wasn't your job, you might find yourself on the transportation team. This meant dragging those massive stone blocks across the desert to the construction site. How, you ask? By sheer human strength with the help of wooden rollers and sleds. Picture yourself and 100 of your closest coworkers straining against ropes trying to move a block that weighs as much as a modern truck. Your feet sink into the sand with every step, the rope burns your hands, and your muscles scream in protest. Once at the construction site, the real fun begins. If you thought moving the blocks was hard, try stacking them with precision. Remember, the Great Pyramid of Giza stands at 481 feet tall. That's about 45 stories high. And you're expected to stack massive stone blocks to create a perfect pyramid shape without the aid of modern surveying equipment or machinery. Let's not forget about workplace safety, or rather, the lack thereof. OSHA would have a field day at a pyramid construction site. There were no hard hats, no safety harnesses, and certainly no workers' compensation. A slip could mean a nasty fall, a crushed limb, or worse. In medical care, well, let's just say that the local doctor's idea of anesthesia was a good whack on the head. Now you might be thinking, at least they got paid well for this backbreaking work. Well, yes and no. Workers were indeed compensated, but not in cash. Payment often came in the form of food rations, beer. Yes, beer was a staple of the Egyptian diet, and simple housing. While this ensured that workers and their families didn't starve, it wasn't exactly a path to riches. Speaking of housing, let's talk about your living conditions. After a grueling day of work, you'd return to a simple mud brick house. These dwellings were small, cramped, and often shared with several other workers. Privacy was a luxury you couldn't afford, and comfort, well, your bed was that reed mat we mentioned earlier, and your pillow was a curved piece of wood or stone. Sweet dreams. Hygiene was another daily challenge. With water being a precious commodity in the desert, regular bathing wasn't really a thing. The combination of sweat, dust, and manual labor meant that by the end of the day, you'd be covered in a thick layer of grime. Deodorant hadn't been invented yet, so you can imagine the lovely aroma wafting through the workers' village. Diet was monotonous at best. Your meals would consist mainly of bread and beer, supplemented with onions, garlic, and occasionally some fish or meat. While this diet provided the necessary calories for hard labor, it lacked many essential nutrients. Dental problems were common, as the bread often contained sand from the grinding process, gradually wearing down workers' teeth. Despite these hardships, there was a sense of pride among the workers. They believed they were doing important work for their pharaoh and their gods. This belief helped them endure the daily grind. Some workers even had the honor of being buried in tombs near the pyramids they helped build, a sign of the respect given to their profession. However, this respect didn't make the work any easier. Injuries were common, and life expectancy was short. Many workers developed arthritis and other joint problems at a young age due to the constant heavy lifting and repetitive motions. Back problems were so common that they were considered an occupational hazard. So the next time you see a magnificent pyramid gleaming in the desert sun, remember the thousands of workers who toiled for decades to create these wonders. Their lives were far from easy, marked by backbreaking labor, harsh conditions, and countless challenges. Yet their legacy stands tall, a testament to human perseverance and the extraordinary achievements possible when people work together towards a common goal, even if that goal is building a really, really big triangle in the middle of the desert. As we sail through the annals of history, let's dock our ship in ancient Egypt, where the shadows of the pyramids loom large. While we often marvel at the grandeur of these structures, we rarely consider the toll they took on the workers who built them. So let's delve into the less glamorous side of ancient Egyptian construction, the health and mortality of the workers who toiled under the scorching sun. Contrary to popular belief, the pyramids weren't built by slaves, but by skilled workers and farmers during the flood season when they couldn't tend to their fields. However, this doesn't mean their lives were easy. Archaeological evidence from worker villages near the pyramids paints a grim picture of their daily struggles. First, let's talk about the backbreaking labor. Workers spent long hours hauling massive stone blocks, each weighing several tons. This constant strain led to severe spinal issues. Examinations of skeletal remains from worker cemeteries show that many suffered from osteoarthritis and degenerative disc disease. Imagine the excruciating pain of trying to straighten your back after a day of lugging limestone blocks in the blistering heat. Speaking of heat, the workers faced relentless exposure to the sun. With temperatures often soaring above 100 degrees F, 38 degrees C, heat stroke and dehydration were constant threats. The ancient Egyptians didn't have the luxury of modern sunscreen or moisture-wicking fabrics. Instead, they relied on linen clothes and maybe a bit of animal fat to protect their skin. Not exactly SPF 50, is it? The workers' diet, while better than that of the average ancient Egyptian, was far from ideal. They primarily subsisted on bread and beer, with some vegetables and occasional meat. This diet, while calorie-rich, lacked essential nutrients. Dental examinations of worker remains reveal severe tooth wear and decay, likely due to the gritty bread that contained sand particles from the millstones used to grind the grain. But it wasn't just their teeth that suffered. The lack of proper nutrition led to various deficiencies. Many workers showed signs of anemia, likely due to iron deficiency. This condition would have left them feeling constantly fatigued, not ideal when you're trying to build one of the world's most enduring wonders. Injuries were an everyday occurrence on these ancient construction sites. Without modern safety equipment or regulations, workers faced constant danger. Crushed fingers and toes were common, as were falls from scaffolding. In fact, some worker skeletons show evidence of fractures that had healed, a testament to both the dangers they faced and the rudimentary medical care available. Speaking of medical care, let's talk about the ancient Egyptian approach to workplace injuries. While they did have physicians and a surprisingly advanced understanding of anatomy for their time, their treatments were often a mix of practical knowledge and mystical beliefs. For instance, a worker with a headache might be treated with a clay crocodile figurine placed on their head, accompanied by a magical spell. Not exactly what OSHA would recommend today. The workers also faced less visible threats. The dust from cutting and shaping limestone blocks was a constant presence in the air. This fine particulate matter, when inhaled over long periods, could lead to serious respiratory issues. Many worker remains show signs of pneumoconiosis, a lung disease caused by inhaling dust particles. It's a grim reminder that even the air they breathed was working against them. Parasites were another invisible enemy. The close living quarters in worker villages, combined with poor sanitation, created perfect breeding grounds for various parasites. Examinations of coprolites, that's fossilized feces, for those who prefer their history less gross, have revealed the presence of intestinal parasites like tapeworms and flukes. These unwelcome guests would have caused chronic health issues, further weakening workers already pushed to their limits. Let's not forget about the eyes. The constant exposure to bright sunlight, combined with airborne dust and sand, led to numerous eye problems. Trachoma, a bacterial infection that can cause blindness, was particularly common. Imagine trying to precisely align massive stone blocks when your vision is constantly blurred and irritated. Despite these challenges, the ancient Egyptians did make some attempts to care for their workers. Archaeological evidence suggests the existence of on-site hospitals or infirmaries. These facilities likely dealt with everything from minor scrapes to major crush injuries. However, given the limitations of ancient medicine, many treatments probably caused as many problems as they solved. The mortality rate among workers was, unsurprisingly, high. While exact figures are hard to come by, skeletal remains from worker cemeteries tell a sobering tale. Many workers didn't live past their 30s or 40s, their bodies worn down by years of grueling labor. It's a stark reminder that behind every ancient wonder lies countless unnamed individuals who paid the ultimate price. In the end, the pyramids stand not just as monuments to pharaohs, but as testaments to the resilience of the human spirit. These workers, facing conditions we can scarcely imagine, persevered to create something that has endured for millennia. So the next time you see a picture of the Great Pyramid, spare a thought for the countless individuals who gave their health, and often their lives, to build a dream that reached towards the heavens. As we wrap up this segment on the health and mortality of ancient Egyptian workers, it's worth reflecting on how far we've come in terms of workplace safety and health. Yet in many parts of the world, workers still face dangerous conditions and exploitation. Perhaps by understanding the struggles of those who came before us, we can better appreciate the importance of protecting the health and dignity of workers everywhere. After all, history isn't just about the grand monuments, it's about the people who built them, one back-breaking stone at a time. As we conclude our exploration of ancient Egyptian workers, let's reflect on the stark contrast between the grandeur of Egypt's monuments and the harsh realities faced by those who built them. The lives of these workers were far from the romanticized notions we might hold today. While the pyramids and temples stand as testaments to human ingenuity and perseverance, they also serve as silent witnesses to the toil and sacrifice of countless individuals. The workers who dedicated their lives to these projects were not slaves, as commonly misconceived, but rather a mix of skilled craftsmen and conscripted laborers from across Egypt. These workers faced numerous challenges in their daily lives. The scorching heat of the desert sun beat down relentlessly as they hauled massive stone blocks and carved intricate hieroglyphs. Dehydration and heat exhaustion were constant threats, despite efforts to provide adequate water and shade. The physical toll on their bodies was immense. Skeletal remains from worker villages reveal a high incidence of arthritis, particularly in the lower back and knees. Many workers suffered from broken bones and crushed fingers, hazards of working with such massive stones and primitive tools. Respiratory issues were also common due to the inhalation of stone dust, which could lead to silicosis, a debilitating lung disease. The lack of modern medical knowledge meant that even minor injuries could become life-threatening if infected. Despite these hardships, there's evidence that the ancient Egyptians took steps to care for their workforce. Archaeological findings suggest that injured workers received medical attention and were often reassigned to less physically demanding tasks. This care was not born purely out of compassion, but also out of necessity. Skilled workers were valuable assets to the state. The workers' diet, while monotonous, was surprisingly nutritious. Excavations at worker villages have uncovered remains of bread, beer, fish, and vegetables. This diet, while basic, provided the energy needed for their grueling labor. However, dental problems were rampant due to the gritty bread that wore down their teeth over time. Living conditions in the worker villages were basic but not as primitive as one might expect. Workers lived in planned communities with designated areas for sleeping, eating, and even entertainment. However, these villages were often crowded and lacking in sanitation, leading to the spread of diseases. It's important to note that not all workers faced the same conditions. Skilled artisans, such as sculptors and painters, enjoyed a higher status and better living conditions than the manual laborers. These craftsmen took great pride in their work, often leaving behind signatures hidden within the monuments they helped create. The legacy of these ancient workers lives on not just in the monuments they built, but in the insights their lives give us into the social structure of ancient Egypt. They remind us that behind every great achievement of the past, there were countless individuals whose names history may not remember, but whose efforts were indispensable. As we drift off to sleep, let's spare a thought for these ancient laborers. Their lives, while difficult by our standards, were integral to the creation of one of the world's most enduring civilizations. The pyramids and temples of Egypt stand not just as monuments to pharaohs, but as testaments to the skill, dedication, and resilience of the workers who built them. As we sail away from the treacherous life of pirates, let's dock our ship of knowledge at a new port of historical intrigue. Our next destination takes us from the rolling waves to the dusty streets of ancient civilization. Prepare to journey back in time as we explore why it was equally challenging to be a common citizen in some of history's most famous empires. As we forge ahead in our journey through the annals of boring history, let's hammer out the details of another profession that shaped the medieval world, the blacksmith. While you might imagine a romanticized version of a muscular artisan crafting gleaming swords for knights, the reality was far less glamorous and much more mundane. Blacksmiths in the Middle Ages were essential craftsmen, but their daily lives were filled with repetitive tasks, scorching heat, and constant physical strain. Let's delve into why being a medieval blacksmith wasn't the heroic occupation you might have imagined. First, let's consider the workplace. The medieval forge was a far cry from the cozy workshops depicted in fantasy films. Picture a dimly lit, smoke-filled space with a roaring furnace at its heart. The air was thick with soot and the acrid smell of hot metal, making every breath a challenge. Blacksmiths spent their days hunched over anvils, repeatedly striking hot metal with heavy hammers. This constant, repetitive motion led to numerous health issues. Chronic back pain, shoulder injuries, and arthritis were common ailments among these craftsmen. The incessant pounding also put them at risk of hearing loss, as the ringing of hammer on metal echoed through their workshops day after day. The heat from the forge was relentless. In summer, temperatures could soar to unbearable levels, causing blacksmiths to work in sweltering conditions. Dehydration and heat exhaustion were constant threats. In winter, the extreme temperature difference between the blazing forge and the cold air outside led to frequent illnesses. Burns were an occupational hazard that blacksmiths faced daily. Sparks from the forge could easily ignite clothing or singe skin. More severe burns from handling hot metal were not uncommon, and without modern medical treatments, these injuries could be debilitating or even fatal. Contrary to popular belief, medieval blacksmiths didn't spend their days crafting elaborate weapons and armor. The bulk of their work consisted of mundane items: nails, hinges, horseshoes, and agricultural tools. Day after day, they would produce the same basic items, a monotonous routine that was far from creatively fulfilling. The tools of the trade were primitive by today's standards. Blacksmiths had to rely on their own strength and skill, without the aid of power tools or precision instruments. This made even simple tasks time-consuming and physically demanding. Imagine spending hours hammering out a single door hinge or crafting dozens of identical nails. The quality of materials available to medieval blacksmiths was often poor. Iron ore was frequently contaminated with impurities, leading to weak or brittle final products. Blacksmiths had to develop techniques to work around these limitations, often through trial and error, which could be frustrating and time-consuming. Despite the crucial nature of their work, blacksmiths weren't always well-respected members of society. In some regions, they were viewed with suspicion due to their association with fire and the transformative nature of their craft. Superstitious beliefs sometimes led to blacksmiths being accused of witchcraft or dealings with dark forces. The economic reality for most blacksmiths was far from prosperous. While skilled craftsmen in large towns might do well, many village blacksmiths struggled to make ends meet. They often had to supplement their income through farming or other trades. Payment for their work was frequently in kind rather than coin, making it difficult to accumulate wealth. Training to become a blacksmith was a long and arduous process. Apprenticeships typically lasted 7 years, during which young apprentices were subjected to grueling work in harsh conditions. Many suffered injuries or health problems before they even became full-fledged blacksmiths. The work of a blacksmith was not confined to the forge. They were often called upon to perform repairs in the field, lugging heavy tools and portable forges to remote locations. This meant long journeys on foot or horseback, exposed to the elements and the dangers of medieval travel. Blacksmiths also faced the constant risk of fire. Their workshops, filled with flammable materials and open flames, were prone to accidents. A moment's inattention could lead to a blaze that not only destroyed their livelihood but potentially spread to neighboring buildings. The social life of a blacksmith was often limited. Long hours at the forge left little time for leisure or family. The nature of their work also meant that they were frequently isolated, spending most of their day alone in the workshop. Innovation in blacksmithing techniques was slow and incremental. The conservative nature of medieval society meant that tried-and-true methods were preferred over experimentation. This lack of technological progress made the work of blacksmiths repetitive and stagnant over generations. As we wrap up our look at the less than glamorous life of medieval blacksmiths, we can see that their daily existence was far from the romanticized version often portrayed in popular culture. Instead of crafting legendary weapons for heroes, they spent their days in smoky, dangerous conditions, performing repetitive tasks that took a toll on their bodies and spirits. Their crucial role in medieval society came at a high personal cost, reminding us that even the most essential professions of the past were often fraught with hardship and monotony. As we drift off to sleep, let's appreciate the comforts and safety of our modern lives, far removed from the relentless heat and toil of the medieval forge. As we forge ahead in our journey through boring history, let's hammer out the details of life as a medieval blacksmith's apprentice. This fiery profession was not for the faint of heart, and the path to becoming a master craftsman was long and arduous. In the smoky workshops of medieval Europe, young apprentices would begin their training as early as 7 years old. These children, often from poor families, were essentially indentured to their masters for a period of 7 to 10 years. The life of an apprentice was far from glamorous, and the work was grueling and dangerous. Upon entering the workshop for the first time, an apprentice would be greeted by the intense heat of the forge and the deafening sound of hammer striking anvil. The air would be thick with the acrid smell of burning coal and hot metal. This sensory assault would become their daily reality for years to come. The first tasks assigned to apprentices were mundane and repetitive. They would spend countless hours pumping bellows to keep the forge fire hot, a critical but exhausting job. The constant physical exertion would leave their young arms aching and their lungs filled with smoke and soot. As they progressed, apprentices would graduate to more complex tasks. They might be tasked with sorting and organizing tools, learning to identify the various hammers, tongs, and files essential to the craft. Each tool had a specific purpose, and memorizing their uses was a crucial part of the learning process. The art of metalworking was not something that could be learned overnight. Apprentices would spend years observing their masters, trying to absorb every nuance of technique. They would watch as raw iron was heated until it glowed a bright orange, then skillfully shaped on the anvil with precise hammer blows. One of the most important skills an apprentice had to develop was the ability to judge temperatures by color. The difference between a successful piece and a ruined one often came down to heating the metal to just the right shade of red or yellow. This knowledge could only be gained through years of careful observation and practice. As they progressed in their training, apprentices would be allowed to assist with simpler projects. They might help in making nails, a staple product of any blacksmith shop. The process of creating these small but essential items required precision and consistency, qualities that would serve them well in more complex work later on. The life of an apprentice was not confined to the workshop. They were often expected to live with their master's family, essentially becoming a part of the household. This arrangement meant that their education extended beyond metalworking to include lessons in etiquette, literacy, and sometimes even basic mathematics. However, this living situation was not always comfortable. Apprentices were at the bottom of the household hierarchy, often treated as little more than servants. They might be expected to run errands, help with household chores, or even care for their master's children, all in addition to their workshop duties. The relationship between master and apprentice was complex. While some masters were kind and patient teachers, others were harsh taskmasters who saw their apprentices as little more than cheap labor. Physical punishment for mistakes or perceived laziness was not uncommon, adding to the already challenging nature of the work. Despite the hardships, becoming a blacksmith's apprentice was seen as a path to a stable and respectable career. In a world where most people were subsistence farmers, the ability to create and repair metal tools and weapons was a valuable skill. A successful blacksmith could earn a good living and gain respect within their community. As apprentices grew older and more skilled, they would be entrusted with increasingly complex tasks. They might assist in shoeing horses, a delicate process that required not only metalworking skills, but also the ability to work with sometimes uncooperative animals. One misplaced nail could lame a horse, potentially ruining a farmer's livelihood or a knight's warhorse. The creation of weapons and armor was another important aspect of a blacksmith's work, especially in times of conflict. Apprentices would learn the intricacies of forging swords, crafting chainmail, and shaping plate armor. Each of these items required specific techniques and an intimate understanding of how metal behaves under different conditions. As they neared the end of their apprenticeship, these young craftsmen would begin to work on their masterpiece. This was a project that would demonstrate all the skills they had acquired over their years of training. It might be a particularly fine sword, an intricately decorated suit of armor, or a complex set of tools. The quality of this piece would determine whether they were ready to become journeymen and seek work on their own. Upon completing their apprenticeship, most would become journeymen, traveling to other towns to work in different shops and further hone their skills. This period could last for several years as they built up their reputation and saved money to eventually open their own shop. The long journey from apprentice to master blacksmith was not an easy one. It required dedication, physical endurance, and a willingness to endure years of difficult work in harsh conditions. However, for those who persevered, it offered a chance at a respected position in medieval society and the satisfaction of creating lasting, useful objects with their own hands. As we cool down from this fiery topic, let's remember that the skills and techniques developed by these medieval craftsmen laid the foundation for the Industrial Revolution that would come centuries later. The humble blacksmith's apprentice, toiling away in a smoky workshop, was an essential link in the chain of technological progress that has shaped our modern world. As we forge ahead in our journey through history's less glamorous professions, let's hammer out the details of a medieval blacksmith's daily grind. Far from the romanticized image of crafting legendary swords, the reality was often more mundane and grueling. Picture this: it's the crack of dawn in a small medieval village. The blacksmith, already sweating, trudges to his workshop before the roosters even consider crowing. His day begins with stoking the forge, a process that's anything but swift. Kindling the fire to reach the scorching temperatures needed for metalwork could take up to 2 hours. That's right, 2 hours of feeding the flames before the real work even begins. Once the forge is hot enough, our blacksmith doesn't immediately start crafting intricate weaponry or ornate jewelry. No, his first task of the day is often repairing farm tools. Imagine spending hours fixing bent plowshares, reshaping worn-out sickles, or patching up holes in metal buckets. Not exactly the stuff of legends, is it? The blacksmith's workspace was a far cry from today's air-conditioned workshops. It was typically a small, dimly lit building with a dirt floor. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of hot metal. In summer, the heat was unbearable. In winter, the constant shift between the intense heat of the forge and the freezing air outside led to frequent illnesses. Let's talk about the smith's constant companion, noise. The rhythmic clanging of hammer on anvil might sound quaint from a distance, but up close it was deafening. Many blacksmiths suffered hearing loss over time, and that's not to mention the risk of flying sparks and metal shards. Eye injuries were common, and protective gear was, well, let's just say it wasn't OSHA approved. Now you might be thinking, at least they got to make cool swords, right? Well, not as often as you'd think. Most of a blacksmith's work was decidedly unglamorous. They spent countless hours making nails. Yes, nails. These simple but essential items were in constant demand for construction and repairs. A skilled blacksmith could make about 60 nails per hour. Doesn't sound too bad until you realize they often had to produce thousands. When they weren't making nails, they were likely crafting horseshoes. This was a critical task, as horses were the primary mode of transportation. But imagine the monotony of shaping horseshoe after horseshoe, day in and day out. And let's not forget, they also had to fit these shoes onto the horses, a task that required strength, skill, and a fair bit of courage when dealing with an uncooperative equine. The physical toll on a blacksmith's body was immense. Hours of swinging a heavy hammer led to chronic back pain and shoulder problems. The constant exposure to heat caused premature aging of the skin. Burns were an everyday occurrence, and more severe injuries were not uncommon. A moment's distraction could result in a crushed finger or worse. Lunchtime for a medieval blacksmith wasn't exactly a relaxing affair. They often ate quickly, if at all, to keep up with the day's workload. Their diet was simple and heavy, lots of bread and ale to provide the energy needed for their labor-intensive job. Not exactly a balanced meal by today's standards. As if the physical demands weren't enough, blacksmiths also had to navigate complex social and economic pressures. In many places, they were bound by strict guild regulations that dictated everything from prices to apprenticeship terms. Breaking these rules could result in hefty fines or even being barred from practicing their trade. Speaking of apprentices, being one was no picnic either. Young apprentices, often starting as young as 7 or 8 years old, faced years of grueling work and harsh discipline. They were expected to learn every aspect of the trade, from the most basic tasks to complex metalworking techniques. Many apprenticeships lasted 7 years or more before one could be considered a journeyman. Now you might be thinking that at least blacksmiths were well compensated for their hard work. While they were generally respected members of their communities, most weren't exactly rolling in gold coins. Many operated on a barter system, exchanging their services for food, livestock, or other goods. Cash was often in short supply in medieval economies. As the day wore on, our blacksmith would likely find himself working on larger projects, perhaps crafting iron fittings for doors or repairing damaged armor for the local lord. These tasks required precision and skill, often achieved through years of practice. One mistake could mean hours of wasted work and valuable materials. The blacksmith's day didn't end when the sun went down. Many worked late into the night, especially during busy seasons. The flickering light of the forge and a few candles were all they had to work by, further straining their eyes and increasing the risk of accidents. By the end of the day, our blacksmith would be exhausted, covered in soot, and nursing various minor burns and injuries. He'd trudge home, eat a simple meal, and fall into bed, only to wake up and do it all over again the next day. Weekends off, vacation time, these were concepts far in the future. So the next time you romanticize the life of a medieval blacksmith, remember the reality. Long hours, back-breaking labor, constant danger, and a workspace that was more inferno than atelier. It was a life of vital importance to their communities, but one that came at a significant personal cost. Now, doesn't that make you appreciate your modern job just a little bit more? As we forge ahead in our journey through boring history, let's hammer out the details of a profession that was both essential and hazardous in medieval times, the blacksmith. While often romanticized in modern media, the daily life of a medieval blacksmith was far from glamorous. In fact, it was downright dangerous. Imagine, if you will, a small, dimly lit workshop filled with the constant clanging of metal on metal. The air is thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burning coal. This was the daily environment of a medieval blacksmith, and it came with a host of health hazards that would make modern occupational safety inspectors cringe. First and foremost, let's talk about the constant exposure to extreme heat. Blacksmiths worked with furnaces that could reach temperatures of up to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. This intense heat not only posed a risk of severe burns, but also led to chronic dehydration and heat exhaustion. The blacksmiths of old didn't have the luxury of air conditioning or even electric fans. They sweated profusely, losing vital fluids and electrolytes throughout their long workdays. But the heat was just the beginning of their troubles. The air in a blacksmith's workshop was a toxic soup of pollutants. As they heated metal and coal, harmful fumes and particles were released into the air. Carbon monoxide, a silent killer, was a constant threat. Prolonged exposure to these fumes could lead to a range of respiratory issues, from chronic coughing to more severe lung diseases. Speaking of lungs, let's not forget about the metal dust. Every time a blacksmith struck a piece of hot metal, tiny particles would fly into the air. These microscopic shards of metal could easily be inhaled, leading to a condition known as siderosis. This respiratory disease, caused by the accumulation of iron in the lungs, could result in shortness of breath, chronic coughing, and even lung scarring. The eyes of a medieval blacksmith were also under constant assault. Sparks flying from the anvil posed a serious risk of eye injuries. Without proper eye protection, which, let's face it, probably consisted of squinting really hard, blacksmiths were at high risk for corneal damage and even blindness. Now let's talk about noise pollution. The constant hammering, the roar of the furnace, and the general cacophony of a blacksmith's workshop would have been deafening. Over time, this exposure to high levels of noise would inevitably lead to hearing loss. It's no wonder that the stereotype of the hard-of-hearing blacksmith persisted for centuries. But wait, there's more. The physical demands of the job were extreme. Blacksmiths spent hours each day swinging heavy hammers, bending over anvils, and manipulating hot metal. This repetitive strain led to a host of musculoskeletal problems. Chronic back pain, arthritis in the hands and arms, and general muscle fatigue were par for the course. Let's not forget about the constant risk of accidents. One wrong move with a red-hot piece of metal could result in severe burns or worse. The workshop was a minefield of potential injuries, from falling hammers to exploding furnaces. In an age before antibiotics, even a minor injury could become infected and potentially life-threatening. The blacksmith's work also exposed them to a variety of toxic metals. Lead, used in some alloys and solders, could cause lead poisoning over time. Symptoms could range from abdominal pain and headaches to more severe neurological issues. Mercury, sometimes used in gilding processes, was another silent killer lurking in the blacksmith's arsenal. Even the water used to cool metal could be hazardous. The sudden contact between red-hot metal and cold water created steam explosions, sending scalding water and hot metal shrapnel flying. It's safe to say that medieval blacksmiths didn't have the luxury of OSHA regulations or workers' compensation. Despite all these risks, blacksmiths were essential to medieval society. They crafted everything from agricultural tools to weapons of war. Their skills were in high demand, and their profession was generally well respected. However, this respect came at a high price to their health and well-being. It's worth noting that not all blacksmiths suffered equally. Those who worked for wealthy patrons or in larger towns might have had slightly better working conditions. They might have had apprentices to handle some of the more dangerous tasks or better ventilated workshops. However, for the majority of blacksmiths, especially those in rural areas, the daily grind was a constant battle against the elements of their trade. The life expectancy of a medieval blacksmith was likely shorter than average due to these occupational hazards. Many probably suffered from chronic health issues in their later years, if they managed to reach old age at all. It's a stark reminder of how far we've come in terms of workplace safety and occupational health. So the next time you see a romanticized portrayal of a medieval blacksmith in a movie or TV show, remember the grim reality behind the profession. It wasn't all about crafting beautiful swords and suits of armor. It was a daily struggle against heat, fumes, noise, and the constant risk of injury or death. The medieval blacksmith's craft may have been essential, but it certainly wasn't enviable from a health perspective. As we close this segment on the health hazards faced by medieval blacksmiths, let's take a moment to appreciate the modern safety measures we often take for granted. From protective gear to ventilation systems, today's metalworkers benefit from centuries of hard-learned lessons. The clanging of the blacksmith's hammer may have faded into history, but the legacy of their struggles lives on in our modern understanding of occupational safety. As we conclude our exploration of medieval blacksmiths, let's reflect on the vital role these skilled craftsmen played in shaping the Middle Ages. Their work was not just about forging weapons and armor, but also about creating the tools that built civilizations. Blacksmiths were often seen as pillars of their communities, respected for their strength, skill, and knowledge. Their workshops were hubs of activity, where the rhythmic sound of hammers striking anvils echoed through the streets, a constant reminder of the ongoing progress and development of medieval society. Despite the romanticized image we might have of blacksmiths, their daily lives were filled with challenges. The intense heat of the forge, the physical demands of the work, and the constant exposure to harmful fumes and particles took a toll on their health. Many blacksmiths suffered from respiratory issues and injuries related to their craft. Yet the allure of the profession remained strong. Becoming a master blacksmith was a path to social mobility in a time when such opportunities were rare. Apprentices would spend years learning the intricacies of metalworking, hoping to one day open their own forges and pass on their knowledge to the next generation. The legacy of medieval blacksmiths extends far beyond the Middle Ages. Their techniques and innovations laid the groundwork for the Industrial Revolution, influencing metallurgy and engineering for centuries to come. Even in today's digital age, there's a resurgence of interest in traditional blacksmithing, with artisans and hobbyists alike rediscovering the satisfaction of working with fire and metal. As we drift off to sleep, let's imagine the distant clanging of a blacksmith's hammer, a sound that for centuries signaled progress, creativity, and the indomitable human spirit. The story of medieval blacksmiths is a testament to the enduring power of craftsmanship and the vital role of skilled workers in shaping our world. Now, as we wrap up our journey through these fascinating yet somewhat mundane historical topics, let's take a moment to appreciate how these often overlooked aspects of history have shaped our modern world. From the hardships of pirate life to the intricacies of medieval blacksmithing, each topic we've explored offers a unique window into the past. These stories remind us that history is not just about grand battles and famous figures, but also about the everyday lives of ordinary people who, in their own ways, contributed to the tapestry of human experience. Their struggles, innovations, and perseverance have all played a part in creating the world we inhabit today. As you drift off to sleep, perhaps you'll find yourself pondering these lesser-known historical narratives. Maybe you'll dream of the clinking of a blacksmith's hammer or the creaking of a pirate ship's timbers, or perhaps you'll simply appreciate the comfort of your modern bed, far removed from the hardships of past eras. Whatever your thoughts as you fall asleep, we hope this journey through the more mundane aspects of history has provided both education and relaxation. Remember, even the most seemingly boring historical facts can offer valuable insights into the human experience and the long arc of progress that has brought us to where we are today. Thank you for joining us on this somnolent historical adventure. May your dreams be filled with the quiet whispers of the past, lulling you into a peaceful and restful sleep. Good night and pleasant dreams. As we drift away from the treacherous waters of pirate life, let's sail towards another fascinating, yet equally mundane chapter of history. Our next topic will explore the thrilling world of medieval crop rotation. Yes, you heard that correctly. We're about to delve into the riveting tale of how farmers managed their fields in the Middle Ages. Prepare yourself for an adventure in agricultural tedium. As we delve into our sixth topic of the night, we're about to explore a peculiar and rather unsettling chapter of medical history. Picture this, a time when the streets were filled with fear, disease ran rampant, and mysterious figures in bird-like masks roamed the cities. Welcome to the world of Renaissance plague doctors. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Europe was gripped by recurring waves of bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death. This devastating disease claimed millions of lives and left societies in turmoil. It was during these dark times that a unique and now iconic figure emerged, the plague doctor. These medical practitioners, often derided as quacks by modern standards, were tasked with treating plague victims and preventing the spread of the disease. But what made them truly stand out was their bizarre and somewhat terrifying appearance. Imagine a tall, imposing figure dressed in a long, waxed leather coat, wearing gloves, boots, and a hat. But the most striking feature was their mask, a beak-like contraption that gave them an almost bird-like appearance. The mask wasn't just for show, though. It served a practical purpose, at least according to the medical beliefs of the time. The beak was stuffed with aromatic herbs, straw, and spices. This was based on the miasma theory of disease, which held that illnesses were spread by bad smells. By filling their masks with pleasant scents, plague doctors believed they could purify the air they breathed and protect themselves from the disease. Of course, we now know that this did little to actually prevent the spread of the plague, which was primarily transmitted by fleas. But in an era before germ theory, it seemed like a logical approach. The full-body leather outfit did offer some protection, acting as a primitive form of personal protective equipment, even if the reasoning behind it was flawed. Plague doctors were often not experienced physicians. In fact, many were second-rate doctors or young medical apprentices. Some were even non-medical professionals hired by cities to treat plague victims. This was because more established doctors often fled plague-stricken areas, leaving a desperate need for medical practitioners of any kind. The job of a plague doctor was, unsurprisingly, extremely dangerous. Many died from the very disease they were trying to treat. Those who survived often faced social stigma, as people associated them with death and disease. Despite the risks, some took on the role out of a genuine desire to help, while others were attracted by the high pay offered by desperate city officials. The treatments employed by plague doctors were, by modern standards, ineffective at best and harmful at worst. They would often prescribe mercury treatments, which we now know to be toxic. Bloodletting was a common practice, based on the belief that it could restore the balance of bodily fluids. Some doctors recommended lancing and draining buboes, the swollen lymph nodes characteristic of bubonic plague. While this could occasionally be effective, it more often led to further infection. One of the stranger treatments involved using frogs or leeches to draw out the evil humors from a patient's body. Plague doctors would sometimes place a live frog or several leeches on the buboes, believing they would absorb the illness. Needless to say, this did little to cure the plague and likely caused additional discomfort to already suffering patients. Plague doctors also served as record keepers during outbreaks. They were responsible for keeping track of plague deaths and would often be called upon to perform autopsies. This dual role as both healer and chronicler of death added to their ominous reputation. The iconic image of the plague doctor has endured in popular culture, often associated with a sense of dread and foreboding. It's a testament to the deep impact the plague had on European society and the desperate measures taken to combat it. Today, the plague doctor costume is often seen in Halloween celebrations or as part of Venice's carnival festivities, a reminder of a darker time in medical history. While the methods of plague doctors may seem absurd or even comical to us now, it's important to remember the context in which they operated. These were individuals working with limited knowledge, facing an overwhelming and terrifying disease. Their efforts, misguided as they often were, represent humanity's persistent struggle against illness and death. The story of plague doctors also serves as a reminder of how far medical science has come. Today, we understand the true causes of diseases like the plague and have effective treatments for many once deadly illnesses. The contrast between the plague doctors of the Renaissance and modern medical professionals in full PPE during recent pandemics is stark, highlighting centuries of scientific progress. Yet there are still lessons we can learn from this chapter of history. The importance of proper protective equipment, the need for accurate record-keeping during outbreaks, and the courage required to face deadly diseases are all as relevant today as they were centuries ago. The plague doctors, for all their shortcomings, were at the forefront of early efforts to understand and combat epidemic diseases. As we drift off to sleep, let's take a moment to appreciate the advancements in medical knowledge that allow us to rest easier than our ancestors. The frightening figure of the plague doctor, once a harbinger of death, now serves as a historical curiosity and a reminder of how far we've come. Sweet dreams, and be thankful you won't be waking up to a beaked figure at your bedside. As we delve into the peculiar world of Renaissance plague doctors, let's explore their daily routine, which was anything but ordinary. These mysterious figures, with their iconic beaked masks and long robes, were a common sight during times of epidemic in Europe from the 14th to 17th centuries. Our plague doctor's day typically began at dawn. He would don his protective gear, a process that could take up to 30 minutes. First came the waxed leather coat, which covered him from neck to ankle. Next, he'd put on his boots, gloves, and hat. The final piece was the infamous beak-shaped mask. This mask wasn't just for show. The beak was stuffed with aromatic herbs, straw, and spices. The doctor believed these would purify the air he breathed, protecting him from the miasma or bad air thought to spread the plague. Common stuffing ingredients included lavender, cinnamon, mint, camphor, and straw. Once fully dressed, our plague doctor would gather his tools. These included a long wooden stick, used to examine patients from a distance and sometimes to fend off desperate family members. He'd also carry a book to record deaths and symptoms, and various medicines and remedies. The plague doctor's first task of the day was often to visit the homes of the infected. He'd walk through narrow, filthy streets, his appearance causing a mix of hope and dread among the populace. Children might run away in fear, while adults desperately called out for help. Upon entering a plague-stricken home, the doctor would examine the patient. However, his methods were far from what we'd consider medical today. He might take the patient's pulse, but he'd do so while holding a sponge soaked in vinegar to his nose, believing it would keep the disease at bay. The plague doctor's treatments were based on the medical knowledge of the time, which was woefully inadequate. He might recommend bloodletting, believing that releasing bad blood would cure the patient. This was often done using leeches or by cutting open a vein. Another common treatment was lancing and draining buboes, the swollen, painful lymph nodes characteristic of bubonic plague. This procedure was excruciatingly painful for the patient and did little to improve their condition. In fact, it often hastened death by introducing new infections. Throughout the day, the plague doctor would administer various concoctions and remedies. These might include herb-infused vinegars, mercury, and even the powder of ground bezoar stones, calcified masses found in animal stomachs, believed to have magical healing properties. One particularly unpleasant treatment involved applying a paste made of tree resin, flower roots, and dried toad to the patient's swollen lymph nodes. The paste would be left on until it dried and fell off, often taking a large chunk of diseased flesh with it. In between patient visits, the plague doctor might be called upon to perform autopsies. These were crude affairs by modern standards, often conducted in the open air or in makeshift morgues. The doctor would examine the corpse, looking for clues about the disease's progression and making notes for future reference. As the day wore on, our plague doctor would continue his rounds, visiting dozens of patients. He'd record deaths, symptoms, and any notable observations in his book. This information would later be used to track the spread of the disease and inform city officials about the epidemic's progress. Despite their best efforts, plague doctors were largely ineffective at treating or preventing the spread of the disease. Their protective gear, while intimidating, did little to actually protect them from infection. Many plague doctors fell victim to the very disease they were trying to combat. As evening approached, the plague doctor would make his final rounds. He might visit the homes of the wealthy, who could afford to pay for more frequent checkups. These visits often involved administering preventative treatments, such as burning aromatic herbs or recommending specific diets. Before returning home, the plague doctor would often stop at a tavern or public house. Here, he'd drink strong alcohol, believing it would disinfect his body and protect him from the plague. This practice, while common, was as ineffective as most of his other methods. Finally, as night fell, our plague doctor would return home. He'd carefully remove his protective gear, a process that could take another half hour. The clothing would be aired out overnight, ready for use the next day. Despite the long hours and constant exposure to disease, many plague doctors continue their work day after day, driven by a mix of duty, scientific curiosity, and the substantial pay offered by desperate city officials. As we reflect on the daily routine of these Renaissance plague doctors, we can't help but feel a mix of fascination and horror. Their methods, while well-intentioned, were based on flawed understanding of disease and often did more harm than good. Yet in their own way, these masked figures represented humanity's earliest attempts to systematically combat widespread disease, paving the way for the medical advancements we benefit from today. As we delve into the depths of medical history, few figures are as iconic and misunderstood as the plague doctors of Renaissance Europe. These bird-masked practitioners were a common sight during outbreaks of bubonic plague, but their methods were far from what we'd consider effective today. Let's start with their striking appearance. The plague doctor's costume was designed in the 17th century by Charles Delorme, a physician to the French royal family. It consisted of a long leather coat, boots, gloves, and a hat, all waxed to repel miasma, the believed cause of disease. But the most recognizable feature was the beak-like mask. This wasn't just for show. The beak was stuffed with aromatic herbs, straw, and spices. Doctors believed these would purify the air they breathed and prevent them from falling ill. Common stuffing materials included lavender, mint, camphor, and cinnamon. Now you might think these elaborate outfits offered some protection. In reality, they were about as effective as using a paper umbrella in a hurricane. The leather wasn't sealed properly, and the eye holes in the mask were essentially open windows for bacteria. But let's move on to their medical practices. Spoiler alert, they were equally ineffective and often horrifying. One common treatment was bloodletting. Plague doctors believed that by draining bad blood from a patient, they could restore the body's balance of humors. They would use special knives called lancets to open veins or apply leeches to suck out blood. In some cases, they would even cut open arteries. As you might imagine, this often led to patients dying from blood loss rather than the plague itself. Another popular treatment was lancing and draining buboes, the swollen, pus-filled lymph nodes characteristic of bubonic plague. Doctors would cut these open and drain the fluid, believing this would remove the evil humors causing the disease. While this occasionally provided some relief, it also increased the risk of secondary infections. Plague doctors also prescribed various concoctions and potions. These ranged from the bizarre to the downright dangerous. One common remedy was theriac, a complex mixture containing up to 64 ingredients including opium, myrrh, and, wait for it, powdered viper flesh. Another popular treatment was to place a live chicken against the buboes to draw out the pestilence. Yes, you heard that right. They believed a chicken could absorb the disease. Once the chicken became ill, they would wash it and repeat the process until either the patient or the chicken died. Some doctors recommended drinking vinegar or eating crushed emeralds. Others suggested more unusual methods. One 16th century physician advised patients to drink a glass of their own urine twice a day. I'm sure that went down well with the patients. But it wasn't all bloodletting and chicken treatments. Plague doctors also engaged in what we might consider more rational practices. They kept detailed records of deaths and infections, which helped track the spread of the disease. They also advised on quarantine measures and the burning of contaminated objects. However, their understanding of hygiene was still woefully inadequate. Many plague doctors believed that strong smells could ward off the disease. As a result, they often carried nosegays, small bouquets of fragrant flowers, or pomanders filled with aromatic compounds. Some even recommended that patients surround themselves with strong odors. This led to the practice of keeping goats in the house, as their strong smell was thought to drive away the plague. I'm sure that made for some interesting living arrangements. Despite their best efforts, plague doctors were largely ineffective at treating or preventing the spread of the disease. In fact, they often became vectors themselves, unknowingly carrying the plague from house to house on their contaminated clothing and equipment. It's worth noting that not all plague doctors were actual physicians. Due to the high mortality rate among medical practitioners, many cities were forced to hire anyone willing to take on the role. This meant that some plague doctors were second-rate physicians, young medical students, or even charlatans with no medical training at all. The job of a plague doctor was so dangerous that in some cities, like Venice, they were housed in isolation and only allowed to interact with plague victims. Their contracts often included provisions for their funeral arrangements, a grim reminder of the risks they faced. Despite their shortcomings, plague doctors did contribute to the development of protective clothing for medical practitioners. Their leather coats and masks, while not effective against bacteria, were a step towards the idea of creating barriers between doctor and patient. As medical knowledge advanced, the role of the plague doctor gradually became obsolete. By the 18th century, their iconic costumes were rarely seen. However, their image has endured in popular culture, often associated with a sense of dread and the helplessness felt during times of epidemic. In conclusion, while Renaissance plague doctors may seem almost comical to us now with their bird-like masks and bizarre treatments, they represent a crucial chapter in the history of medicine. Their efforts, misguided as they were, paved the way for more scientific approaches to disease prevention and treatment. So the next time you see a plague doctor costume at a Halloween party, remember, behind that beaked mask lies a complex history of fear, desperation, and humanity's ongoing struggle against disease. And maybe, just maybe, be grateful that modern medicine has come a long way since the days of chicken treatments and urine cocktails. As we conclude our journey through the bizarre world of Renaissance plague doctors, we're left with a mix of fascination and gratitude for modern medicine. These masked figures, once a symbol of hope and dread, now serve as a reminder of how far we've come in our understanding of disease and treatment. Despite their best intentions, plague doctors were often ineffective in treating the bubonic plague. Their bird-like masks stuffed with aromatic herbs did little to prevent infection. The long, waxed leather coats they wore provided some protection, but their methods were based on flawed medical theories of the time. One of the most misguided practices was bloodletting, where doctors would cut patients to release bad blood. This often weakened already vulnerable individuals, making recovery even less likely. Another common treatment involved applying mercury or arsenic to buboes, the swollen lymph nodes characteristic of the plague. Needless to say, these toxic substances did more harm than good. Perhaps the most peculiar aspect of plague doctor treatments was the use of miasma theory. They believed that bad air or miasma caused diseases. This led to some truly odd remedies, such as burning aromatic woods and herbs or carrying posies of flowers to purify the air. While these might have made things smell better, they did nothing to stop the spread of the plague. It's easy to look back and chuckle at these misguided efforts, but we should remember that these doctors were working with the best knowledge available to them at the time. Many risked their own lives in an attempt to help others, even if their methods were ineffective. As we drift off to sleep, let's take a moment to appreciate the advancements in medical science that separate us from those dark times. From the crude bird masks of plague doctors to the sophisticated personal protective equipment of today's healthcare workers, we've come a long way in our battle against infectious diseases. Thank you for joining us on this journey through some of history's less glamorous moments. From pirates to plague doctors, we've explored the often overlooked, sometimes uncomfortable, but always fascinating aspects of our past. As you close your eyes, let these stories remind you that even in our most challenging times, humanity has always found a way to persevere, learn, and grow. Sleep well, and may your dreams be free of bird-masked doctors and their questionable cures. Good night.